to understand the history of anti-Semitism. 2,000 years ago, Jews don't accept Jesus as Messiah. For people who do not have faith, as the early Christians, as some of them have faith, some of them accept Jesus, but they don't really in their heart. And you and I both know people like Rob McCoy who accepts it fully in their heart, and other people who are doing it without faith. And those who have less faith, the fact that a Jew exists, let alone thrives, is a threat to their faith, because how can the Jew not accept Jesus as God and still thrive? Unless he's associated with the devil. So you start having these myths that are created of the Jew being identified with the opposite of God. This really codifies in 1144 in Norwich, England, what's called the Blood Libel. This is really important to understand, especially today in 2024. In 1144, a young boy is killed, and the local priest says that's because the Jews need to make their matzah with Christian blood. It's called the Blood Libel. It's blame the problems of other people on the Jew. It's just so you know, that's so ridiculous, not only just on its face, but we're forbidden from even having meat that has any blood in it. This is a Torah law. You can't have, that's why, we can't have steak tartare. Okay? So this gets perpetuated in combination with a 4th century, what's called the Vulgate.
I'm sorry, did you say in 1140 this happened?
1144 in Norwich, England.
Okay. You get all that? 1144, right? It's 11. Yes. We're talking about AD 1144 and some other stuff. So yeah. Hello?
Yeah.
That's a long time ago. Well, in my life, it's yesterday, because I live in the 12th century in my imagination a lot. And so, 1140, 1144, those are, let's be precise on the dates, which, good on Candace that she made sure it's 1140. No, it's 1144, AD 1144. I think it's significant that it's like double ones and double fours, and we'll probably figure something out like meaningful in that number, AD 1144.
She seemed to be incredulous, and who could blame her for somebody bringing up something that happened 1,080 years ago or didn't? Right?
Well, okay. So from my perspective, he's Rabbi Barclay, who had this conversation with Candace Owens some weeks ago, right? Is doing a Putin on her, right?
He's trying.
Well, so we're not, you guys are going to be grateful. We're only going with that minute and 34 seconds that we just showed you to dissect tonight, because it's going to take the whole stream to figure out what went on in AD 1144 and why Barclay is bringing it up. But it's very similar to what Vladimir Putin did to Tucker Carlson. When you say, do you have a few minutes? 30 seconds? I'll give you a little backstory.
Good point. Yeah. A little backstory, which wasn't at all smug. Right?
Well, yeah. and when we did that one, I was like, yes, the Middle Ages, make history medieval again. Okay, yeah. Good. We get to do it again, because AD 1144 is, of course, bang in the middle of the Middle Ages. So here we are. But you weren't persuaded. I mean, were we persuaded when
I'm
Putin
not persuaded.
did it?
I mean, I think it's interesting that you compared it to Putin had a very specific short-term goal in mind, which was to bring his interviewer up to the current moment of saying why they're fighting right now,
Right.
why we're fighting right now, and why we meaning him, the Russians and the Ukrainians, right? To give a little background as to it was giving diplomatic background basically to this whole area that's being fought over. What Barclay was doing was just using an old, victim branding technique to bring his subject into submission. To me, it sounded like.
So different rhetorical.
He was there to rhetorically beat her up, basically. Try to. She didn't succumb to that. It's like you will agree with me, and you will say that this is horrible and it's uniquely horrible, right. And you will. Putin didn't care if Tucker agreed with him or not. He's just saying, look, I'm just going to give you the facts. That's what brought us up to here. Different.
Okay, fair. But they are doing the same thing. I mean,
but they did say, let's talk about history. Although his grasp of history, I don't think is that great either. But you'll go into it more.
Well, Putin, I can confirm that Putin's is somewhat stronger than Rabbi Barclay's. Yes, but that I do find it interesting in these. I mean, both of these are in war situations at the present, as we pointed out. It's like saying Putin is trying to explain to Carlson what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and Barclay is trying to explain to Candace Owens what Israel is doing in Gaza.
Well, he's trying to explain why it's not the same. He's trying to explain why it's okay if they do it.
Well, I mean, to be fair, so was Putin.
Well, Putin was, I think, if we do it. I mean, he was just talking about a piece of land that's being disputed, which sounds exactly like Gaza, except the way Barclay was putting it, he wasn't really focusing on a piece of land that was disputed. He was focusing on the right of his people, past grievances for this land to make sure they're safe. Whereas Putin was saying Ukraine actually used to be part of Russia, and there's not actually disputes this. This territory's been the border has changed. He was a lot more specific. He was very detailed in the diplomatic history of this piece of land that's now being fought over. But just I didn't hear grievance coming from Putin. I heard nothing but grievance coming from Barclay, and his position did not start with let's talk about history of this disputed land, which would be perfectly valid. It's very disputed land,
right?
It has been for thousands of years. That would have been interesting. No, his perspective was we've been more hurt than anybody else in history, and therefore we're justified in what we do. It's like wait, what? And that was the basis of his argument. I'm not buying it. I'm not accepting it. Candace wasn't accepting it. I think he's got a problem. If he thinks he's speaking for a whole people, they've got a problem, and I don't think he is. But
well, we are not going to figure out whether he's speaking for anybody other than himself right there. I mean, President Putin is speaking as president of Russia, and Barclay was speaking as a rabbi, as far as I can tell. You're right. It wasn't clear on whose behalf he was politically or formally speaking. So there's it's a different. It's not the same kind of diplomatic exchange.
Yeah, that's part of what I found like really off-putting about it was he was there supposedly giving his own opinion, and at the same time claiming it's the opinion, and at the same time demanding somebody accept it. So here I'm going to demand you accept my terms. It just sounded like a really like he was doing some kind of negotiation, which again I could see the semblance to the other interview, but to what end? I mean, I think we were discussing before whether this is just an interview or was, in my opinion, was this an actual negotiation? Because Barclay wasn't running this like he was running it more like a cross-examination. Like he immediately tried to put.
I would use a more pointed term, Inquisition. I mean, it was the feeling of it was you have fallen into heresy, and I am here to correct you, and particularly by the end, right? If you all have watched the whole thing, it's nearly 2 hours long, and it is a very interesting, as Casey is describing, it's emotionally and rhetorically completely different in flavor and tone from Carlson and Putin.
Yeah, well, my feeling is that when people do stuff like that, they don't really have much of a leg to stand on, and so they're trying to use rhetoric and emotion to force an agreement, because they're not going to be able to do it with facts.
Well, but this is why we need to talk about the 1144, because it was actually a fact. It's
the year?
No, and there was an event in 1144 that is actually significant in the kind of. I do agree with you on the emotional level, but I'm more sort of horrified and interested in the use of history for this kind of technique. That Putin, we talked about, was using this backstory, this long backstory going back 1,000 years, to create a kind of claim, right, a diplomatic claim on the territory, and that that being a mode of argument that I said goes back to the 19th century. I mean, it's like he's defining a nation according to its territory and its language, and then ultimately, its soul. He ended with the religion and saying we are of the same soul, so we will be united. What Putin, as I was watching Putin's discussion with Carlson, it felt like this very kind of old style history in that 19th century nationalism vein. Mm-hmm. With Barclay, obviously, it felt very different because the affect of the two interlocutors was so different. I mean, Owens was very, very calm throughout the event. She was impressively. If you guys want to just watch someone being very calm while she's being yelled at, you don't even have to have the sound on. Whereas Carlson was laughing and somewhat nervous with Putin, who was the opposite, right? So we've got master classes on either side of these things of like how to stay calm in these charged conversations. But Barclay, the thing is, it does matter that he tried to suggest to her about a deep backstory, because he's also making a 19th century move, but it has a different kind of flavor to it. Although, interestingly, what he's doing with specifically the anti-Semitism argument is also a 19th century nationalist trope, right? It's like Putin is making the argument about the nation is because of the territory and the language, and ultimately we're a people. The anti-Semitism argument is developed around the same time to create an argument that the Jews should have their own land too. But they do it in a different mode of we have. I mean, partly because they're mostly living outside of where they want the argument wants to take them. So you need to leave wherever you're living in Germany or the United States or France and go to this other place because the people there hate you.
That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Well, and the thing is that the AD 1144 that Barclay pointed to is one of the pieces of ammunition in that proof of argument that they hate you. So we're fighting the 19th century again, but and nationalism again, but with a kind of different valence of argument. And it's interesting that both of these are like charged for everybody out in the public sphere right now, because you call nationalism, oh, you're Nazis. Anti-Semitism, oh, you're Nazis. Well, I mean, the
they never say, oh, you're a socialist.
Well, that would be globalist. International, the International. That they're trying to make arguments for separating peoples out into groups, obviously.
So you think Barclay is doing that for the same purpose, for Zionism?
The anti-Semitism argument as it originates in the 19th century is for Zionism. Yes.
Right, but do you think Barclay is also doing that for Zionism in his arguments and his use of these 19th
Well,
century
I'm not
arguments?
positive he knows it's a 19th century argument because he started it from AD 1144. I don't know, right? And maybe let's talk through this and figure out what we think is going on, because he did start with the definition, and which Owens pointed to several times, saying that's, you're shifting it, right? It's like we're hated for different reasons, but the hate is the constant. The anti-Semitism is whatever doesn't want the Jews to exist, which maps onto and doesn't want Israel to exist too. So I don't know whether he was making a specifically Zionist argument as opposed to a Jewish argument, but the problem of group identity in that mode is a creature of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why throwing people, doing that sort of, 1144, everybody blinks and they're like, oh no, there's history I don't know. Now I'm dumb.
Yeah.
And the best thing that Owens did was say, wait, 1140? And he's like, no, 1144. It's like, get the date right. Okay, fine. Now we can. So it's like, I have an investment in this because you're using the Middle Ages as a boogeyman in this.
Well, yeah, that's popular, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
It's
an anti-Catholic boogeyman.
It's an
too.
anti-Catholic boogeyman, right? It's you. As long as you say, oh well, it's the Dark Ages, and what you heard him say when he started all of this, it's like, well, let me tell you, I'm going to tell you some backstory here, Candace. That when from the early Christians, he mentions in like a minute and a half, early Christians, somebody whose name I don't recognize, 1144 in the 4th century. Right? And all of this is meant to be part of the same argument, which is people who don't have sufficient faith need to blame the Jew for not recognizing Christ because their faith is inadequate.
Yeah, I caught that. And I'm thinking, well, is he the arbiter of who has a strong Christian faith?
Well, apparently a lot of the early Christians, he caught himself. It's like he's saying back in the early Christians, they didn't have faith. Wait, no. Rob Roy does. Wait, who's that? Right. So there's several layers of rhetoric being played out here. But the thing that I think he was hoping would work on people is nobody knows what happened. I mean, Candace couldn't even hear it as 1144. She was like, 1140, what? He's relying on everybody knowing nothing about the Middle Ages. And so the apparent precision of that date is going to dispel all argument against what he just said.
Okay.
As a historian, I find this, I find this, well, I think that there's strong words for it, but it's Scott Adams had those who do not study history are doomed to repeat the things that appear in history books that never actually happened. My corollary for tonight is those who do not study history are doomed to be bamboozled by people who are able to remember dates and who do not cite their sources or the difficulties with interpreting them.
Well, how could you question him? How could
he know the date, right?
Right, that's the flavor.
Well, I'm not going to worry about whether he's a Jew or not. He's sitting in front of a lot of books. That's what I'm going to worry about.
No, I mean, he is. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, he is that, but that was the flavor. That was, I'm going to tell you. And it was very condescending.
It was condescending, but he was sitting in front of a lot of books. So we're going to talk. We've got some books.
I'm sitting in front of Amanda, but I never.
I have a lot of books and I don't put them behind me. I put them in front of me. So we're going to read some of them. But I wanted to start with that. We're going to focus in on 1144, right? But I wanted he started folding in some other things, particularly back in the 4th century when Jerome does his translation of the Vulgate. He mistranslates the Hebrew word for rays of beams of light coming out of Moses's face, allegedly, to horn, and makes them horns. Okay, one, that's a perfectly good Latin translation. Horns can mean beams, right? But he claims that from that Vulgate translation, which is, as you said, it's incredibly anti-Catholic because that Vulgate is in English, the English translation of the Vulgate is the one the Catholic Church still uses, right? The Douay Rheims, right? So by sliding that in there, saying Jerome was such a bad translator that the Christians were wrong about Moses for, centuries because they thought he had horns in his head.
I have never heard that in my life. This is really interesting.
Well, I think the first time I heard it is because Michelangelo and his statue of Moses, and if you know Michelangelo's statue of Moses look pretty ripped, right? He's like, this is not someone you're trying to make look unimpressive. Michelangelo gave him the horns too, and so by the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, it is an iconographical trope to show Moses with the horns.
I received a very small St. Jude statue as a gift once, and he also had a horn coming out of his head. It was actually a flame, but because it's sculpture, right? It's their flames coming as the flames. And I remember several people asking me, "What is
their flames?"
Yeah, that's their flames. So I explained, and it's like, oh, okay, right,
right. But they're flames, and the thing is, there are later medieval images from the 13th, 14th, 15th century after 1144 that the flames are, some of them look more flamey and some of them are starting to look more like horn-like, but everybody knows what it is Moses goes up on the mountain, speaks to God face to face, and when he comes down, his face is shining, and it's so terrifying to everybody that he veils himself because it's
right, and it's radiant, right? So it's out like that. It's just emanating from him like sharp points, almost. I can imagine people saying,
right, they're beams of light, and that his face is shining. And of course, throughout the Middle Ages, I'm doing a whole class on this right now, guys. If you want to follow my medieval Christian mythology, we're talking about this desire to see God that is constant in medieval Christianity. And the great debates by the later Middle Ages are, do the saints see God in the beatific vision now, or is it only going to happen after the resurrection? It's like, at what point do people get that vision that Moses had, or that Peter, James, and John had at the Transfiguration? At what point are you going to be in the presence of the divine to such an extent that you are transformed by it, which Moses was when he sees he's up there on the mountain. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what Barclay claimed, what Rabbi Barclay claimed, was because Jerome was a bad translator and translated the Hebrew word for beams as kornua, that medieval exegetes and commentators would think Moses was a demon with the horns, right?
So he thinks Catholic like philosophers, theologians thought Moses was a demon.
Well, okay, I'm eliding. He thought they had horns, right? And he's trying to create this image of, yes, Jews have horns because Moses was given horns by this bad translation, and that's what he's doing. He's building up this idea.
Wow, that's a stretch.
That medieval Christians are so stupid that they don't understand what happened with Moses on the mountain was, godly.
Okay, that's a new one on me.
Well, there is.
I mean, I've never even heard that in the context of medieval history of that. Well, of course I didn't.
But again, that's what he's counting on. He's counting on people being horrified by the Middle Age. Oh my gosh, it's the Dark Ages, and they must have been stupid and bigoted then.
Well, that's the propaganda, isn't it? That's been going on for 200 years at least, right? And
yes.
I know enough about the medieval Europe to think, okay, that does not sound plausible at all. Let me look into this, right? But I think you're right. I think he's counting on ignorance.
Well, he's counting on fear of the Middle Ages and fear of Catholicism and fear of weirdnesses in Christianity. And he's counting on people being too afraid to have their illusions dispelled of being good, that they won't go look and find out, oh my gosh, were the medieval Christians actually as evil as he's describing?
Yeah.
Okay, so on screen right now, I'm showing you the Ashburnham Pentateuch, which is one of our very oldest Latin copies of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the 5 Mosaic books, right? The book is very important because it was illustrated. It's a very early illustrated version of the Bible, and it was copied probably in the late 6th, early 7th century, around the time of Pope Gregory the Great. So it's really significant. It particularly comes from Rome, and it's therefore associated with his papacy. But we don't know exactly where it was made. It could have been made in Spain. It could have been made in North Africa. It could have been made in northern Italy. It could have been made in Rome. What we do know is it was in Frankish Gaul by the 8th century, and it kept at Tours in France from the 9th century for 1,000 years. It's there in Tours for 1,000 years from the mid-9th century to the 19th century, right? So this is a very precious book kept in the same place for 1,000 years, and has illustrations of events in the Old Testament with, and this is very significant for our purposes right now, with the translation that Jerome makes from the Vulgate, with the horns, allegedly, right? Yeah. So now I'm showing you right now the opening that shows Moses on the mountain. We're going to zoom in and see, Moses talking to God on the mountain, clouds, flames, no horns. 0 horns, right? So this is, it's like the old, these early Christians seem to know the difference between cornua as beams and putting little flamey things on his head, right?
So in order for it would have to be the illiterate Christians who only saw the pictures, who understood that Moses was holy, and the literate ones who were doing the reading and writing that thought he had horns. Something
like that. Who knows? I mean, people make up all sorts of stupid arguments about Christians being dumb, right? And the primary,
that's
and the primary one, as you say, it's like, okay, a book like this, if you have it, you can read because it's a book. We had this whole sort of long discussion about pictures or books of the illiterate, but as you're right, if the illiterate only sees this book, no horns. So in fact, it would be only the people who could read it that are going to see that Moses was horned, his face was horned, and yet the illustrators drawing it don't seem to put horns on. And it's also important about it is this is clearly a Christian manuscript, not one, it's got pictures, but it shows Moses with the tablets. I'm zooming in on another part of this image, come down from the mountain, and he's celebrating what looks a little bit like the Eucharist, although that's in figure, right? It's like we're saying whatever he does in the tabernacle is a representation of what the liturgy is going to be in the church. So this is a Christian manuscript. He's not shown with horns. There's no horns on this image. He's simply Moses receiving the tablets of the law, which is revered by Christians as a figure of the law of, law that Jesus fulfills. So.
And it's very clear in the picture.
And it's clear in the picture.
So all one need do is look at the picture. You don't have to read, medieval Latin script.
And I can prove it with the medieval Latin script, which I'm now showing. If anybody's looking, and you can, I've image 179 of the Ashburnham or Tours Pentateuch, which you can look up on loc.gov because the whole scan is up there on the Library of Congress. It's not hard to find, right? And we have here in red, it actually has, it's nice because the rubric for this verse is in red. We have in the Vulgate translation, Cumque descenderit Moises de Monte Sinai, tenebat duas tabulas testimony. So when Moses descended from the mountain of Sinai, he held the 2 tablets of the law testimony. Ad ignorabat quod cornuta, and that's the bit in red. I've circled the cornuta for you, so you know I'm not lying. Asset facie sua ex consortio sermonis domini, and he did not know that his face was cornuta from his conversation with the word of the, his consortio, his conversation with the word of the Lord. Okay, it says he's horned. The picture doesn't show any horns, so it's beams. And likewise, videntes autem Aaron et filia Israel cornutum Moises faciam timererent propria catere. When Aaron and the sons of Israel saw that his face was shining, they were afraid to approach him. This is exactly what Rabbi Barclay said medieval Christians were incapable of understanding. Maybe we have a better case to make for what goes on in AD 1144 than he does. Perhaps. Okay, so we promised you guys there's a stack of books. It's a real stack of books. This is a photograph of my stack of books. They're all here, right? I got them. I'm gonna be pulling them out and reading from them, because we want this to be properly demonstrated that there is an argument out there. Most of the books in this stack are 25 years old. And that to me is interesting too, because this is something that has been discussed in academia now for at least 25 years, in depth, in detail, with references. And the kinds of things that Rabbi Barclay was saying are like this mishmash of innuendo that would be embarrassing for an undergraduate to repeat.
Yeah.
Are you ready to read some history? Okay.
Yes.
All right. First, you were well.
Let's hear
it.
Okay.
So she knows what I was going to point to, but she hasn't necessarily read everything I'm about to read. So prepare to be startled with Casey.
Oh, I don't remember, but
well, that's fine. One thing you were saying at the beginning when you're saying what he was trying to make an argument about was that all of this was unique. Can you say a bit more about that again?
Okay, so he was trying to say that I'm trying to remember what I was saying. He was talking about Jews being attacked at different points in history, and being singled out for being different was unique in all of human history, and that no comparisons should ever be made to anybody else's tragedies, to anything the Jewish people have gone through since 1144.
Okay. Yeah. And they're very specifically towards the end of the discussion, he was trying to get Candace Owens to answer the question which he was asking her: will you say that what happened on October 7th is unique in its atrocity?
Right. I mean, how could it be unique? I mean, our own country's 245 years old, and we've been attacked a couple of times, on our own.
Well, the unique is very important there, right? And that it needs to be unique. Our first witness.
Yeah, it's not right, but it's not unique. Genocides are not unique.
Well, interestingly, that word was, she tried to ask him about genocide, and he refused to define that term.
Yeah.
The uniqueness of the conversation, the thing about it being unique is something that my former colleague Peter Novick, who passed in 2012, explicitly addresses in The Holocaust in American Life, which I've been recommending for some years now, and I'm pleased that we're able to talk about it in a little bit more detail here. In his introduction, on page 9, I will show the camera that it's where I'm reading. He explicitly takes on this argument because it was already, this book was published in 1999. It was already in 1999 a feature of the way in which the Holocaust was being discussed in America. And Peter was specifically concerned about that claim to this point, right? There's a larger part of his argument, which we're going to get to towards the end, about group identity, but he's setting himself up in the argument here, and he's saying the grounding of group identity has produced not just a game of show and tell, but also this other feature in Jewish discourse. In Jewish discourse on the Holocaust, we have not just a competition for recognition, but a competition for primacy. This takes many forms. Among the most widespread and pervasive is an angry insistence on the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Insistence on its uniqueness or denial of its uniqueness is an intellectually empty enterprise for reasons having nothing to do with the Holocaust itself and everything to do with uniqueness. A moment's reflection makes clear that the notion of uniqueness is quite vacuous. Every historical event, including the Holocaust, in some ways resembles events to which it might be compared and differs from them in some ways. These resemblances and differences are a perfectly proper subject for discussion. But to single out those aspects of the Holocaust that were distinctive, there certainly were such, and to ignore those aspects that it shares with other atrocities, and on the basis of this gerrymandering to declare the Holocaust unique is intellectual sleight of hand. The assertion that the Holocaust is unique, like the claim that it is singularly incomprehensible or unrepresentable, is in practice deeply offensive. What else can all of this possibly mean except, quote, your catastrophe, unlike ours, is ordinary. Unlike ours is comprehensible. Unlike ours is representable.
I don't know why anybody wouldn't love those sentiments hurled at them.
But this is, I mean, that it was.
I mean, it's an excellent point.
This is, again, Peter Novick's The Holocaust in American Life. He was one of our greatest Jewish scholars at the University of Chicago, said this 25 years ago. And it's interesting that it's continued to be a feature in the conversation, is saying, and that's quite literally all Candace was trying to say. It's like, it was an atrocity. Yes. It was horrible what happened on October 7th. And he wanted her to say it was unique in its atrocity.
Yeah, that was the weird part. That was a bit racist, wasn't it? That it was unique. You can't deny that aspect of what he was attempting. He was attempting to put forth his sea of Jewish life over anybody else's throughout history, not just on October 7th. This is unique, right?
Well, that was at the point when she said the phrase that people have clipped, that your religion does not trump my religion, and this is to say, at some point you say October 7th trumps the Holocaust, so October 7th is unique and the Holocaust is what? So I mean that what Novick is pointing to is the problem of, like, if you're going to talk about an event at all, it's going to have things that are like and unlike other events. And this atrocity competition is
well, that's the sickening part
deeply
of it.
offensive.
It's a competition.
Yes.
It is offensive. Novick was absolutely right. God bless him.
Yes.
That's just awful, tact to take. And I'm laughing because if somebody tried this with me, I would probably laugh in their face if they tried. I don't know how Candace did it, to have somebody say to you, I want you to admit right now that your life and the lives of your ancestors are worth far less than any one of mine. What? I mean, it's like, are you a sane person?
Well, and that she has been specifically vocal about not, taking that kind of stance on Black Americans.
It's bait, isn't it? You just yeah, exactly. This is the whole her and Ye West with their White Lives Matter shirts on, which started this whole attack against West, and now by extension her.
But it's the uniqueness. Just I want everyone to understand this claim of uniqueness is something that Peter already addressed 25 years ago in his account of the way in which the Holocaust had become the thing that defined Jewish identity in the United States. And I'll come back to, I want to put him aside for a bit, just to point out that uniqueness claim is already a problem, and consider some other elements of what Barclay was doing, and we'll come back to Novick. But that just out front should set off some alarm bells. All right. So there was another thing that you were saying about, okay, so the Jewish experience generally is unique in its, I mean, this is the anti-Semitism, right? And this is one of the things that I find saddening that Peter also will address it towards the end, but that we are given a story in which the Jews are hated by everyone throughout history.
Yeah, it's to be,
and particularly Christians. That's particularly,
specifically
Christians.
Catholics.
And we, that I mean, that's what Barclay was doing with the 1144 and the horns.
This is the second time in about 3 or 4 months I've heard a Jewish voice get on television or the internet now. Yes, some old people, and claim that the Latin Vulgate Bible, and they were absolutely disgusted looks on their faces when they said it, still teaches this. Can you believe it? Right. And I think that this generally hated by Christians used to mean Catholic, and now it does. They're bringing that back because it was vector rhetoric before.
Right.
But because there's been this split in Christendom over the past centuries, and one that's, I don't want to get into too much of that because it's completely off topic, but there's a very unique section of Protestant Christianity right now that is very, very pro-state of Israel and very attached to Zionism. And I think.
Okay, you're right. That's off our topic right now. We have. I don't have the sources for that one right now.
But it was. No, it was related. It was related to this kind of uniqueness, like they were uniquely hated, right? The thing was they weren't, and they were. It's going to dig deep into my own memories of my own history lessons from ages ago, but it was very difficult to move around in the Middle Ages because you were essentially tied to the town you were born in through culture and familial ties. And if you moved from one town to another, it didn't never happen, but it almost never happened because you went really. This was probably most recognizable in ancient Greece and places like that, where the cities were actual states.
Okay, that we can do that another time as a problem.
Okay.
And that one of the things we're going to find is people did move around, and that created some of the problems in Norwich in 1144.
Yeah.
But the
well, they were invaders.
Well,
but,
there is an argument. This is by a book by another of my University of Chicago colleagues, David Nierenberg, who has made the argument that there is an anti-Judaism that runs throughout the Western tradition. This is it's an interesting book because it's very intellectual history level book, and it doesn't deal with. I don't even think it dealt much with William Norwich in here, does it? See, book. I have it. Book. I'm looking in the index. Yeah, William Norwich. He's mentioned on one page, right? So this book is dealing more with the certain particular examples and how to think about them interpretively to figure out where the anti-Judaism is coming from. But what David does is a little different, showing that there is, in the Western tradition, from before Christianity, in fact, strands of anti-Jewish argument going back all the way to Egypt, apparently. So that, he does have a whole chapter. If you want to check my references, he does go through the anti-Judaism of the New Testament and shows how Christianity is in fact developing in conversation with the Jews, right? And yes, Christianity disagrees with the Jewish interpretation of Messiah, but the problem with the degree to which the Jews are or not hated, it seems to be able to be there without anything to do with Christianity, because his first chapter is on Egypt, and particularly the question of a debate over a Jewish temple on the island of Elephantine in the 7th century BC. But there's a in the Jewish story or in the Exodus story, the Hebrews leave Egypt. In the Egyptian stories, the Egyptians kick them out. So there's different perspectives.
They were encouraged to kick them out.
So it
by the actions of God.
It all becomes a little complicated. So that there is, in fact, he says an anti-Jewish tradition in Egypt, and the huge question is obviously why, right? What is it that these Hebrew communities, Jewish community, I like saying they're whether they're Jewish or Hebrew, I think is complicated because Judah is a particular tribe and the Hebrews are the whole people. Where it comes from, right? And as you were talking, I thought you were going to go here, right? That there are reasons that the Jews have difficulties that are not unique to being Jewish, which to a certain extent has to do with there being money lenders and go-betweens.
But that, and also because they're
foreigners, right?
Right. Because if you're never going to fit in. First of all, if you move to a place en masse, like large family groups, like maybe would be like constitute a small town, into another town, you're going to make a very big presence there. And if you've got your own traditions, customs, language, religion, you're going to seem very strange. And people had very good reasons, especially back then, to be very skeptical and very, very fearful of strangers. Because if people moved into your area back then, it was usually by invasion, by raiding. Like I'm thinking of the Vikings right now, right? What happened on October 7th, for instance, happened in Irish villages and English villages for centuries.
This is true. Yes, the Vikings show up and steal people and sell them.
They steal, they rape, they pillage.
Yeah.
They destroy.
No, that's medieval history. But that's the part where before they come. No, wait.
The Vikings were not Christians when they were doing this, but they were doing it to Christians. Right. But nobody, I can't say nobody said that.
See,
mind.
this is why it's like read lots of history, lots and lots and lots and lots of books.
It's not unique.
But for example, Thomas Sowell has made the argument about the problem of the Jews being the middleman characters in Europe fits with the Chinese in Malaysia. Or the Malaysian?
Well, here's the thing.
They're. I mean, the Jews throughout medieval Europe were people with extensive trading connections across Christendom, Islam, and into Asia. Benjamin Tudela, very famous travel account. He goes from northern Spain to Italy to Baghdad, and and through the Holy Land, right? And at every point, he's mentioning the communities of Jews he came across, because he knows they're there, right? So there's that. The foreigner is the one who also has the connections outside of your region to be able to bring luxury goods in, right? The trading and
you add to that, in a lot of these in Europe, they were at most times I think prohibited from owning land. Probably wasn't because they were Jewish; it was because they were foreigners.
Again, we could do a whole stream on France, which Bill Jordan has done like extensive and detailed studies of exactly what happens with the Jews there. But what I'm trying to get it very specific here. One, that they have an outsider role, and as they did in Egypt at the time, right? They're in diaspora, so they're spread around the region. And for example, one of the passages that David cites is about the conquest of Jerusalem by the Hellenistic Persian king Antiochus in 134 BC, which is the conquest associated with Hanukkah, right? So this is Diodorus Siculus reporting on the relations of the Jews with Egypt, right? So, see, for example, Diodorus Siculus reports that when the Hellenistic Persian king Antiochus conquered Jerusalem in 134 BCE, quote, the majority of his friends advised the king to take the city by storm and to wipe out completely the race of Jews, since they alone of all nations avoided dealings with any other people and looked upon all men as their enemies. They pointed out, too, that the ancestors of the Jews had been driven out of all Egypt as men who were impious and detested by the gods. See, that's the story of the Jews are driven out of Egypt because they're impious, rather than that they are led out of Egypt by Moses.
Because they were impious to the Egyptian gods?
Right. Okay. For by way of purging the country, all persons who had white or leprous marks on their bodies had been assembled and driven across the border as being under a curse. The refugees, having organized the nation of the Jews, made their hatred of mankind into a tradition. Again, this is pre-Christian Greek description of the Jews.
That sounds familiar. Yeah. I mean, the argument.
And on this account, it introduced utterly outlandish laws, not to break bread with any other race, nor to show them any goodwill at all. Rehearsing all these events, his friends strongly urged Antiochus to make an end to the race completely, or failing that, to abolish their laws and force them to change their ways. And you could say David's talking about how these stories are creating this image of the Jews, but it's significant that it has this kind of story predates Christianity, and as everybody knows, the Christians are all Jews. The Christians are all of the people that fit in this, right? The early Christians. So that doesn't go in the place it would. And then interestingly, David doesn't talk about this in detail. Like what the Romans did to Jerusalem had zero to do with what the Christians thought about the Jews.
Correct.
When Titus Titus under the Emperor Vespasian destroys the city and captures all of the temple furniture and puts it on the ark of Titus with the candelabra and the other ornaments and things like that. Those are pagan Romans. They're not doing it because they like the Christians.
No, they were. Yeah, I mean, the Christians weren't a big problem to the Romans at the time, but they were still enemies because we wouldn't worship, but they were small. I mean, the anti-Judaism in the New Testament, that's a family fight.
Right.
That's one Jew against another Jew.
Right, that's the family fight over who's the rabbi and and whether Jesus is the Messiah. Right. And Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, is specifically written for that argument. It's very clear that he's constantly quoting the scriptures that Jesus is fulfilling. That kind of argument only makes sense if you actually already accept the scriptures. Right? I mean, that's what's funny about it. It's like, yes, Matthew is showing Jesus in competition with the Sadducees and Pharisees, because he's trying to show, yes, he's the one. He's the one who fulfilled our story. Right. So, yeah, it's an internal thing. And the Romans aren't caring about that. They're just worried about the uprising among the murder. Yes. Which leaves the Jewish tradition with a deep and abiding continuous to this day, as we saw with Adam King's discussion. Yes. Between Gavin and Nick Fuentes and Vince James, hatred of Rome, which will come back into our conversation tonight, right? But
that is strange. But I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, the hatred of Rome. It's like, but they had cause to hate Rome. Rome wiped out their city, and a generation later in 135, right? Masada.
Well, didn't a couple of different invading armies do that? Temples, right?
Well, yes, Nebuchadnezzar did that, and then and
Cyrus so why gives are they them focusing on Rome.
Well, because it's the most recent one, I suppose. AD 70.
2,000 years ago.
Well,
okay.
Got long memories here. Come on, we do backstory. Look, we Christians do backstory too. Come on, this is AD 2024. We can't laugh at them for having long memories. Just saying. AD 2024, although we're not still yet at 2,000 years after the crucifixion. That's in 2033.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Back in the Middle Ages, they paid attention to these things. I'm looking at Masada, just that David talked about Masada. 59. Right. So what we're learning is there's long-term grievances on multiple sides here. Oh no, the only reference that David gives to Masada, or at least in the index, is in the Jews in a difficult position when they're surrounded by armies of Muslims and angels. When is this? When they're determined to put an end to Muhammad. Should they acknowledge what, according to Ibn Ishaq, they knew to be true, that Muhammad was the prophet promised in the Torah, and convert to Islam? Or should they, echoing the zealots in Masada, sacrifice their own women and children and then perish in a last suicidal sally? In the end, at this point, they decided to surrender unconditionally. But remembering that in Masada, when they're being attacked by the multiple Roman legions, apparently it takes many, many legions to take out this Jewish revolt. The defenders at Masada, realizing that they're going to be overwhelmed, kill themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a historian smuggled out, right? I can't remember his name. A Jewish historian who wrote about it.
Josephus talks about the fall of Jerusalem, but I think Masada is a different.
Yeah.
I don't know the historiography of Masada as well. Right.
Okay.
So we're saying there's on the one hand, the historiographical argument about things being unique is offensive because you're playing atrocity Olympics. But there is something distinctive about the story of Judaism that we maybe need to attend to, which is also featuring in 1144. Shall we go to 1144? Here we are in Norwich, map. It's 1144. class, what do you notice about this map? All right, so on the map, the Jewish quarter is circled in red, helpfully. I got this off Wikipedia, so you guys can go look it up too. There is a purple bit, all right, so there's a monastic precinct, which is where the author of the life and death of William Norwich lived, right? The monastic precinct, right? And then there's a big purple bit. I gave you this map. Do you remember what the purple bit was?
I don't.
That's the old town, right? I'm gonna look up the map and make sure I'm reading it.
That's where the Jewish quarter was not in the old town?
No. So the purple bit is the Burgess of Doomsday, or the English Burg, right? So the bigger purple bit is where the Anglo-Saxon population lived, right? The ones that are there and are English, right?
Right.
And we
pre-Norman, yeah.
Pre-Norman? Who are the Normans? Oh, look, they're the green bit, right? And it says Novus Burgus, French or Norman quarter, organized as a separate burg. So we have a castle in the middle, we have a purple town, which is the old town, and we have a green bit, and the Jewish quarter, the Jewry, who live nearby the castle, are in the green bit. I wonder how long that had been the case. Okay, you're talking about these Normans. Who are the Normans?
Well, William of Normandy, William the Conqueror.
What did he do?
He conquered.
He's one of those Vikings, the long-term story Vikings, yes, right? Yes, but from Normandy, which is in France, right? Northern France. And he comes from Normandy in... You do have to remember this date.
1066.
1066, right? You guys will remember 1144 after this, but 1066, William comes over from Normandy, lands in England, and
takes over everywhere.
I'm sure that was a cuddly conquest. I'm sure it was a really cuddly conquest, don't you think?
No, I don't think it was. I think people were rather miffed that he was taking their stuff.
Well,
and planting his people there in their place.
Yeah, he killed all the nobility, for sure, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that, we know that we can make map. This is not a medieval map on screen. This is a more recent rendering. That we can draw this town so accurately and say things like the Burgess of Doomsday or the English Burghs. Of course, Doomsday Book was William's grand survey of all the stuff he'd stolen, called Property. Right. And we can tell from things from Doomsday Book, for example, that there is a Jew mentioned in Norwich in Doomsday Book, but that most of the upper nobility of the Anglo-Saxons were dead by the time William died. His own family hated him so much his body exploded before they got it buried at Caen.
William?
Yes,
Really?
He was not a nice person.
Henry VIII. What the heck happened?
Well, they're fat, I guess. But
oh, I never heard that story. That's. Ugh.
I had a student do a paper on William the Caen, where he founds these double monasteries back in Normandy, and he's buried at St. Stephen's in Caen, but when he died, he wasn't there, and by the time they finally got his body to where he was going to be buried, it had burst.
Ew. I take it he died in the summer. Oh.
Actually, I don't remember. Anyway, so but you can see the map tells a great deal, right? That you have the old town, and then you have the Normans doing their very efficient conquering thing, which is plant a new town, restructure the whole thing, put a new castle in. They often also put like new churches in, so create a new market, create a new power center. It's just like coming in now and putting up skyscrapers and offices and stuff.
Gentrification. It's normification. Yeah.
Why would the Jews be living in the Norman part of the town?
Because
yes. Right. And this is it's one of the things that Barclay's narratives vastly eliding is the Jews had probably been in Norwich for less than a decade when William died. Right. So what you were saying about them being newcomers, yes, they were completely new, like less than 10 years. And as you were describing, it's like these are towns that there was more mobility than people think, but there's not as much mobility as now, right? It's not like renting your apartment in New York and not knowing any of your neighbors for 50 years. Or me here in Chicago, and I don't know my neighbors and live in the next building, right? It's like, that is not the case. Everybody knew everybody in these towns. They're not that big. Yeah. And these Jewish settlements, they're brought in, what were the Jews good for the Norman kings?
I could only take a guess and say they were a buffer, but they were also, I think they were also changing money. Right.
They're good agents, right? It's like they do the money lending, but they have the international connections. We know that, right? It's like, that's one of the ways all these stories travel. They're definitely involved in long distance commerce throughout the period. They're not actually the only money lenders. They're like, Italians are also, Lombards are often brought in as money lenders too, but they're equally disliked. Yeah. So it's money lending is, kind of parallel, but they're also under the control of the king. And that is one of the very significant features of everything that happens in the William and Norwich story. Pop quiz: are the Jews in Norwich, when they're accused of murdering this young boy, killed?
Are the Jews killed, or were they in the village when the young boy was killed?
So 1144, the Jewish community seems to have been founded sometime around 1135, but I think we don't know exactly. Right. So they've been there for about a decade. The body of the young boy is found in the town,
right, in the woods,
right? And we do have this is Thomas Amama's complete account of you can read the whole thing, and it's in a Penguin paperback, so it's not expensive. Everybody go buy it, so you know what the story is. That his body is found in Thorpe Wood, and he's clearly been brutalized in some way.
Yeah, he's tortured to death.
Right. And his family, who are English, although he has a Norman name, accuse the Jews, which doesn't actually come out of nowhere.
It came out, I think, according to the Cohen article that I read, it was the accusation came from his aunt, from the child's aunt. He was living with the aunt and uncle, and he was working as a tanner's apprentice, and he was working, supposedly he was working for a Jewish family, which doesn't make any sense to me, because I don't think they did tanning or anything. Maybe they just owned the business. I don't really know.
Well, this goes against, it's like, yes, there are Jews that do things other than money lending in the towns. The Jews are primarily urban, but they do have other skilled work.
Right. So it was the aunt who had accused them, because she mistrusted them from the very beginning, and that could very well be they were foreigners, and she didn't trust them. They didn't trust the Normans either.
They didn't trust the Normans either. Okay, so the Jews are accused. Are they summarily executed by all those stupid Christians? No. Why not?
They run to the castle and say, "I don't have to answer any of your questions. I'm under the protection of the king." And they go up to the castle, and they're protected
by.
I can't.
It doesn't matter. The local Norman sheriff, right?
Right.
And the
the sheriff.
So this is the reality of all of these situations. In every story that you have of some kind of mob activity in these towns throughout the Middle Ages, there's multiple jurisdictions in the towns to start with, and very often in the stories you'll find one guy is protecting the Jews. It's very often in Germany, it's the bishops, particularly along the Rhine in their communities. So there's in England it's the king's sheriffs, because they're under the king's law. They're protected. Now this has the obverse effect, for example, as it happened in the late 13th century in 1290, when the king says you're leaving. Since they were not under the local law of the English or the Normans, but under the king, he has both protection and jurisdiction over them.
Right. You can either protect them or escort them out. Right.
I really, really want to know whether, like, Balfour was Norman, Oh my gosh. The Normans have long memories about how to negotiate these kind of relationships, and I can that maybe they did it again with Israel. Wait.
Oh, the Balfour Agreement. I'm trying to think. You're skipping around. I got to keep up with you.
Right.
Yeah. Balfour. Yeah. Sounds French to me.
I think we have questions, right? So, and the thing is, this kind of what Barclay was trying to get you to do was be afraid of Christianity and Christian bigotry.
Yes. Oh, it was more than that. It was he wanted you to despise it as much as he did. You could see the contempt. That was what was just so about that interview. And I'm you in kilts were watching this video, and I said, okay, I'm going to watch the video. I lasted about a minute and 14 seconds. I don't know how Candace is doing this, but I do know what was discussed in the interview because we talked about it a lot.
Right.
But yeah, the contempt and the fury that he was displaying and the demands he was making was just so off-putting. It was just so off-putting. Yeah. Anyway, I'm lost now.
So the point is within Norwich and the history of England, the Jews are I feel sorry for them because they are caught in the middle of some incredibly stressful local politics.
Well, that's by design, right? I mean, they're a buffer. I mean, they're doing the jobs that the Christians can't do because they're not allowed to take interest or collect money or do things like that. But they're also a buffer. So it's very possible that the accusation was thrown on them for that reason.
Well, so this is
it's also possible they were guilty.
Well, we need to do one. Everybody, fact check us as we're talking and go do some research, right? Because
sure, absolutely.
There's good scholarship out there now on, money lending and the complexities of the situation in the Middle Ages, and particularly, as I've just mentioned, between there's Italian money lenders for sure that we think about banks. That's the banca, the bench that the Lombard money lenders use, and money lenders, bankers, the bankers, right, are unloved. Regardless of whether they're
anywhere, poor
Italian or Jewish or
the bank. Now the Lombard is that Venice? I don't know
northern Italy,
very well.
Northern Italy, and so I think I know a lot about. Well, I'm referenced in this book in the William Norwich translation because one of the features, which is going to come up in our conversation here, one of the features of this Jewish presence in 12th century England is the conversations that it provokes about the incarnation, right? It's incredibly important that there are now Jews in England, particularly in Canterbury. There's some very important debates that some rabbis have with monks and other scholars, including most likely Anselm of Canterbury, who writes, he's Archbishop of Canterbury, writes his Why God Became Man around this time. He's from northern Italy, goes to Bec in Normandy as a monk, and then is made archbishop after his former abbot Lanfranc dies. So there's a route from northern Italy up to England, Canterbury, and it's very. All of these guys are talking to each other. Again, another massive slander against the Middle Ages is that all the Christians are so stupid they don't talk to anybody.
That's if people knew how much these people knew, just a normal educated person back then, not like a super genius like Thomas Aquinas, but just your average student, they would probably be really shocked.
They would. And they also would be shocked that, in fact, this is what I said, all of these, this book is, Miri Rubin's translation is more recent, 2014, right? But Peter Novick's book is from 1999. The next book that I'm going to bring up after Miri's is from 1999. My book that we're going to get to is from 2001. Most of this is stuff that we've been talking about for a long time. It's great that people are talking about it now in the public sphere, right? Maybe Rabbi Barclay will do some more reading. What we do know of medieval intellectual life in the 12th century is it's highly fertilized by these conversations between Christians and Jews. They're talking to each other.
Mm-hmm. Including St. Jerome, correct? Right.
St. Jerome's in the 4th century, so...
Oh, he's much
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah.
So,
In the 12th century,
yeah.
around 1144 specifically, the Christian, clergy actually is having some pretty intense conversations about problems like, was Jesus born of a menstruating woman?
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
That's why the incarnation, because from a Jewish perspective, what the Christians are finding out, it's disgusting. He was born through a woman's vagina, right?
That is the normal way of being born.
Well, yes, but and again, the Christians are finding this out because there's conversations going on in northern France. Rouen has a very important Jewish community. Paris, and these people coming from on the continent into England, they're also in conversations with the clergy. So it's complicated.
How did they do that when they hated them so much?
What?
How did Christians talk to the Jews when the Christians hated them so much?
Well, they're moving them into their towns. Oh, but so the thing is, yeah. I think the Normans are using them because there had been Norman communities there have been Jewish communities in Normandy, and the Normans were used to having them as their agents. And I think they moved them into the English towns because they had likely settlers that they could bring in.
It almost sounds like an administrative class.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And they have high administrative positions, famously in Italy, and particularly, this is one of the things Benjamin of Tudela talks about in his itinerary. He goes to Italy and he meets all of these Jews that are in the Curia, the papal administration. So yes, the Christians are hiring them. They're talking to them. They're learning Hebrew from them, particularly in Paris at the School of St. Victor, and they recognize the theological questions that they have. There's another. I can actually do this off the top of my head fairly extensively, but one of the other people that I write about in my book, Rupert of Deutz, is famous because he has a conversation with a Jew who they're in conversation about how horrified the Jew is by an image of the crucifixion, and I think he may actually see a trinity, a Gnadenstuhle, so that he sees the Father holding the cross with the dove. And after talking with Rupert, he converts, and then he writes a book about it. So we have his conversion story about how he talked to Rupert of Deutz, who was in Liège at the time, I think, and converted. So conversions are happening, conversations are happening, a lot of going, it's like the way Barclay tells it, it's ignorance and horror. And, oh yes, you Christians only do this because you don't have strong faith. That's a misrepresentation of the entire complexity of the situation. Oh, and if we don't want people to do caricature versions of what we're living through right now, let's not do it to the past.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The ignorance is off the charts. Yeah. But he did what he did to get a reaction out of her, to get her angry. It didn't work.
True. So where did the story come from, right? So I did give you some homework, and you did read Jeffrey Cohen's. If you want one article, everyone, to read, although you have to find someone who can subscribe to Speculum for you, because it's Speculum 79, 2004. Excellent, deep, detailed article by Jeffrey Cohen on this story. And Cohen does a brilliant job showing the fullness of all of the different tensions in the town, and he's also going into the blood imagery and so forth, but he's going into great depth there, right? Other elements of the story that you remember that we want to highlight?
Cohen said something I did note on page 18. Yeah. He admits that there was no evidence of anti-Semitic, what he calls mythologies of Jewish murders in Norwich at the time. There weren't any.
Excellent
Those
point.
Came much later.
Excellent point. Yes. Well, Barclay actually said this. It's codified in AD 1144 because it's the first one. Yeah. This is the first time ever that we have a story of this type, that there's a child, actually he's probably about 12 or 13.
12.
Yeah.
He's 12, which is apprentice age. He would have been a new
apprentice.
Yeah. Yeah. He's, let's see, a little bit.
No, go ahead.
Like you said, there weren't any. There was no evidence. I found the tone of the article was that he was assuming a lot. He did provide a lot of detail, which was good, but a lot of it was detail not directly related to the murder of this boy. Probably because, as you pointed out, there wasn't any direct evidence. There was no evidence of it before then, and in fact, nothing happened in that way for several years after the boy died. And then for some reason, 2 to 3 years later, you start hearing these stories of the sanctity of the little boy and his corpse and the miracles that were surrounding it. I think he might have even been incorrupt for a time, I think they claimed. But they claimed the odor of sanctity, which meant God was present, this sweet smell around his body. And all these stories started coming out, but they didn't come out immediately. And there wasn't anger widespread immediately. It was something that seemed to have been stoked at a later date, probably for political purpose. But it's the short article. It's like 41 pages. He didn't go into that. That would have been interesting to see, well, who instigated it and why. The aunt was immediately accusing them. That sounds like a fact. That doesn't sound like a myth, that the aunt was accusing them of doing that. Not that they were guilty, but he also mentioned briefly, again, because there wasn't a whole lot of stories, he mentioned something that happened later in France where a man is accused of killing his son for converting to Christianity, and that was mythology. And I thought, no, wait a minute. Stuff like that happens today. That's not actually that implausible.
Right.
Right? So that might not have, it's like any bad story you hear should be neither immediately true or false. But the assumption is that every bad story you hear is absolutely false. And I think that was the vibe coming off of Barclay in the interview with Candace. And it was also a bit of the flavor of the article I was reading. Now, I'm not very well read on the subject.
Well, this is why it's nice to give you as a test, right? Because I'm unfortunately better read than I enjoy on this unpleasant subject. And I mean, Cohen, I like Cohen's. I was rereading it today, and I read it, I think, pretty much when it came out. That it's in Speculum, which is the Journal of the Medieval Academy. So it's already internal discussion, right? He's talking to the medievalists, then, right? He's not talking to the general public. He's talking to those of us who know this kind of history, and we want really good details on the story. And then he did that, and then 10 years later, Mary Rubin did the translation of the full text, which I think still hasn't been edited. There's not that many manuscripts of it.
Might have to add that to my growing collection.
Right. Well, don't try keeping up with me. Unless you have more walls.
I have books on my shelf. I'm like a book collector more than a reader.
Fair enough.
I'm trying to get better. Trying to get better at the reading part of it. So.
That she had to make the translation from a transcript because there's not an edition yet. But the story was communicated and people seem to be referencing it later. There's not that many copies of the actual story. It's like I think it's 1 or 2 manuscripts. I forgot to double check on that. It's early copies, Cistercian. There's.
Can I make one more point about the Cohen article that kind of stood out at me?
Sure.
So he's describing, this is the kind of detail he did provide a lot. He was describing the Norwich and the different societies within it, and how the English were subjugated is not the right word. They were second-class citizens. They were treated as such,
right?
And they hated the Normans. But at the same time, yes, this little martyred boy, as they were calling him, had a Norman name. He was named William.
Right.
His aunt's name was very, very English, and so the people were already mixing and intermarrying. Now, people who hate other people, do not name their children after those people, after those people's culture. That's not something that's going to happen. You would hate that. I remember.
Yes, he's named after the conqueror, obviously.
He's named after the conqueror, right? So, and by the family of second-class citizens who's working as a tanner, which is considered one of the worst jobs because it's just horrifically bad smelling. Frankly, that's just it. I can imagine it'd be tough to get the smell off you, but it's one of the dirty jobs, right? That people did. So yeah, I'm not sure the assumption of class hatred to the extent that he described it in the article doesn't match the fact that there were so many people intermarrying and borrowing names from each other's cultures. But that's just an observation I made. Like I said, it was only a 41-page article. So
well, you have already cracked one of the enduring debates in English history, which is Michael Wood has a great essay on this in his In Search of England on the Norman yoke, right? And it's a big debate in Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Norman England. It's like, to what degree was there a great rupture? Did the Normans bring in all true administration? And the Norman families, that's why I'm joking about Balfour being Norman or not. Montgomery, who Wood talks about in this, definitely was. And he ends up in a little tea party conversation with Lord Montgomery over...
Montgomery of the Second World War?
Maybe, yeah, possibly. Yeah, I think so. Okay. So there are aristocratic families that definitely go back to the Normans and not to the Anglo-Saxons because they all got killed. It's a huge question the degree to which the Anglo-Saxon kingdom had an administration. They probably did, which is why it was wealthy, which is why William wanted it. But what you're describing is like, indeed, how much interaction was there after the conquest? And the more we see, the more, yes, there's lots of mixed families, but with tensions. Say, these are the conqueror's family. Why are you marrying into Walter Scott famously makes a feature out of this in Ivanhoe, because it's the Saxon Kedrick Rowena marries the Norman Ivanhoe eventually and brings peace, right? So it in the 19th century, it was a big mythology about exactly the degree to which the two peoples did or didn't mix.
Yeah, I mean, I could see the nobility class doing that. I think William was he not married to one of the a daughter or granddaughter of the King of Scotland, right? I think
Matilda, yeah,
Matilda, right? But the lower
Henry.
classes, the working classes, were also doing this.
Yes,
right?
Yes. I've got my Matildas mixed up too. There's a bunch of Matildas, and one of them comes in.
Yeah, she was Matilda. Okay. Yeah. Margaret of Scotland's granddaughter, right? I think. Yeah.
So we have this vast complexity, animosities, conversations. How do we end up with this as the origin of that atrocious story that Barclay said we have?
How did the story come down into history?
No, not that. Well, the thing is, I think
they established a cult, right?
Yes. So Thomas of Monmouth comes along and writes an account, right? He writes it.
All right.
In sometime after AD 1150, and he's the reason we have the story at all, because he interviews the family, I guess, and gets the story and collects miracles and things like that, and wants to make the case that in fact it was the Jews, because of course no Jews were harmed in this story. Because
no. I mean, did they? I didn't know, because I haven't read that book yet. Did they continue to live in Norwich after this? Okay.
Yeah. They're protected by the sheriff, who says no, there's no evidence. But then Thomas, writing the death of William, needs evidence, right? So he's going to get some evidence. Right. And he's got various proofs. He ends up with 6 proofs. 7 proofs. 7 proofs. It's the 5th proof that gives us the most detail that we need. Don't worry about the other proofs. Okay. So one argument that he brings in, which is very, and I think Cohen actually talked about this. We also interpose as an argument of faith and truth what we have heard told by Theobald, Do you remember Theobald in your reading? A person who was once a Jew and later one of our monks. In other words, a convert.
Oh, okay. Right.
Okay, so this is astonishing and quite like confusing and terrifying. Thomas of Monmouth claims that he got the story that we're about to hear about why the Jews killed William from a monk in the community who had been a Jew. And I told you, it's like Herman Judah, who talked to Rupert of Deutz down there on the continent and converted. It is true that people are converting in the period.
Yes.
And so we have Theobald as, according to Thomas, a convert. He told us, Theobald did, that in the ancient writings of their ancestors, it was written that Jews could not achieve their freedom or ever return to the lands of their fathers without the shedding of human blood. Hence, it was decided by them a long time ago that every year, to the shame and affront of Christ, a Christian somewhere on earth be sacrificed to the highest God, and so they take revenge for the injuries of him whose death is the reason for their exclusion from their fatherland and of their exiles as slaves in foreign lands. Therefore, the leaders and rabbis of all the Jews who dwell in Spain at Narbonne, where the seed of kings and their glory flourishes greatly, meet together and cast lots of all the regions where Jews lived. Whichever region was chosen by lot, its capital city had to apply that lot to the other cities and towns. As the one whose name comes up will carry out that business as decreed. This is all still, according to Thomas, reported to him by Theobald, who could be making it up. Okay, but...
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the Chronicles of the Elders of Zion.
In that year, however, when William, the glorious martyr of God, was killed, it so happened that the lot fell on the men of Norwich, and all the communities of the Jews of England offered their consent by letters or by messengers for the crime to be performed at Norwich. I was, quote, I was at the time in Cambridge, a Jew among Jews, and the crime of the action performed was not hidden from me. This is Theobald apparently reporting it to Thomas. With the passage of time, when I learned of the glorious greatness of miracles which by divine virtue happened through the merits of the blessed martyr William, I was greatly afraid, and consulting my conscience, I left Judaism and converted to the faith of Christ. Okay, so this is, for Thomas, this is, a good...
I'm with the sheriff. There's no evidence.
There wasn't. I mean, it's like no evidence. There was a body found, and the boy did die. Cohen points out this: in modern times, we would not hesitate to blame the gruesome murder upon a pedophile or serial killer. Right? We won't read this description of the murder. It's quite graphic.
Right.
But
as it probably was a pedophile that did it, or something like that at the time. But
he's 12 or 13. He's tied up.
Yeah.
They find a teasel in his mouth, which is strange. There's weird details in the account.
Yeah.
But yes, Theobald saying, I heard of the miracles and therefore I converted. These words indeed of the Jewish convert we believe to be all the truer for having learned them from a converted enemy, revealed by someone privy to the secrets of the enemies.
Yeah.
Okay, now...
Yeah, that's sketchy.
Okay, but we are now at the point that I wanted to get you to, where you're going, what? Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Like...
Aren't you glad
yes,
I did?
Yes, set you up.
So I went, yeah, right on.
Set you up beautifully, right?
That's bizarre.
What? Okay, now we have established, I hope, to the extent of curiosity, that the Christians at the time were not ignorant idiots. Why would they believe any stories like this, right? This is the sort of magical thinking that I find. So Putin's argument about nationalism and territory and language is an interesting kind of diplomatic argument, but the sort of everybody magically starts hating everybody else story is.
Well, it's because one of our own wouldn't do this. It's got to be the other, right?
Fair. I mean, but we do have, the thing is, we do have coroner accounts from England when they're not Jews being accused of horrific things. So there's one I can think of some guys who, it's like, you always think of the If anybody's making arguments about how peaceful Europeans are, they weren't until about yesterday.
Oh, good grief, no.
Right. And we have accounts of some pretty brutal murders that are, found to be committed by known people in local communities. So it's not like just, somebody dies, they look for a Jew. That's not what happens.
No, I would say, well, they look for another. And then he had been working for a Jewish family, and therefore, I can see where accusations would fly like that. Yeah, but it's not just because they're Jewish. It's because they had, they had proximity to the victim, and there were others. So, but then it is true that later there are more stories like this when children die.
I mean, Williams is the first such account, and it's strange, but it's strange to get this story from Theobald, right? It's like, why would you have a proof like this coming out of nowhere of the Jews deciding to take revenge by that the Jews could not achieve the freedom or ever return to the lands of their father without the shedding of human blood? Yeah, that's a strange thing. I mean, I know why he was looking for this, because they started the cult for this child, veneration, and a cathedral held his corpse. Right. That's why Thomas is writing the life. So he wants.
Right. But to come, I mean, that's quite a story to come up with. Yeah. They could keep that secret. Doesn't that many people know it? I mean, if what the converted monk said was true, you'd have to believe that thousands of people across, the continent were able to keep this a secret until this one guy converted. There were other converts. How come they didn't talk? Because he's saying like, oh yeah, everybody knows this, right? This is what we do. It doesn't make any sense. So it's an odd story to come up with. Like,
apparently out of the blue,
why would you believe
Jews murder children?
Yeah. It's really strange.
I wonder where they got that story. You ready?
Yep.
Okay, so both Mary Rubin and Jeffrey Cohen in his article reference this book. I'll read to you what Rubin points to it. It's Israel, Jacob Yuval's Two Nations in Your Womb, Perceptions of Jews and Christians in Late Antiquity and the Middle Ages. And he makes a I should have marked this. Should put it. Books that don't have footnote or don't have indexes. Okay. When studying, this is Rubin saying this, when studying long-term trends in Christians' ideas about Jews, historians vary in how much weight they give to context and contingency. We've been trying to figure out exactly where all these stories come from in the Middle Ages. They're complicated. It's confusing. It's local. Is it general? Where is it? All right. Israel Yuval has emphasized the mirror-like, even reciprocal nature of Jewish Christian attitudes. Oh, wait. They're talking to each other, and they do know what each other says, but mirror-like, as a set of ingrained assumptions always tested by each group against its views of the other. Now, that may seem like a kind of neutral thing to say. The Christians are responding to Jews, and the Jews are responding to Christians. Mm-hmm. Apparently, in Jewish historiography, until Yuval said that was not really accepted. It was a premise, he talks about it in the book, it was a premise that in Jewish historiography, no, Christianity may be responding to Judaism, but Judaism does not respond to Christianity, never touches it. You may have come across this kind of argument in certain claims that there's no mention of Jesus in the Talmud, because why would the Talmud ever mention Jesus? They don't care about Jesus. Yes, it does mention Jesus. Christians in the Middle Ages learned that it did. They learned the details of what the Talmudic stories say about Jesus, and it's actually part of it. Yes, and this is what Yuval's giant argument was, right? This one was, in fact, that the two nations in your womb is Esau and Jacob of Rebecca, and that the competition between these twin brothers is actually mutually constitutive, right? That they do respond to each other. And we can say that for, Christianity itself, that Christianity and Judaism, as we know them both now, Rabbinic Judaism arises out of its competition with the Gospels and the Christian preachers making claims about how to read the scriptures. Yuval says that kind of content, and he starts in antiquity, right? That kind of reciprocal argument goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that there's a very specific thing that the Christians are in fact responding to in the 12th century with these arguments like about what happened to William, that comes out of something that the Jews did that the Jews did that comes out of something that the Jews were telling themselves about what they needed to do in order to defeat the Christians. It's complicated.
What did they think they needed to do to defeat the Christians?
Yuval suggests that 12th century prejudice against the Jews of Europe may have developed out of violent encounters, beginning with the pogroms of the Rhineland in 1096. Oh, okay, so the Christians killed Jews. Not exactly. When Jews publicly chose death for themselves and their children over conversion or death at the hands of crusading armies and local communities.
Okay. Yeah.
As happened at Masada.
They'll kill their own children. They'll kill yours too.
That's Yuval's argument, yes. And what's interesting is Cohen actually acknowledges that he finds that a persuasive. Let me find it for you. I better have marked it. Sorry, I'll look for it this way. There we go. So this is on page 40. The footnote to the text is, several contemporary sources allude to the martyrdom of William, but Thomas of Monmouth is the only writer to narrate that death in any detail. He is also the only source to provide an obsessive account of secret Jewish rites occurring in the city and of the sanguinary flows that were supposed to accompany them, which we just read, right? That's the Theobald account. And then at the footnote he says, the best critical overview of the scanty medieval sources for the William legend is, again, McCullough, Jewish Ritual Murder. That's an earlier study. The Reuben is more detailed now. And then Cohen goes on. I am in substantial agreement with McCullough's suggestion, based upon the pioneering work of Israel J. Yuval, that the ritual murder myth arose in the aftermath of the Ashkenazic Jews' choice of death over forced conversion during the Crusader-inflicted persecutions of 1096. I would go even further, however, and argue that this spectacular choice to take one's life al-Kaddish Hashem for the sanctification of God's name, and the flow of blood that resulted from these actions, invariably these martyrdoms were accomplished by the knife, often with parents taking their children's lives before their own, resulted in a fascination with Jews and sanguinary ritual. For a good overview of the al-Kaddish Hashem, contextualization of its medieval Hebrew inscription, and a warning about the dangers of overplaying its existence as an unmediated historical event, see Jeremy Cohen, a 1096 complex, Constructing the First Crusade in Jewish Historical Medieval and Modern. And then there's a book on the actual practice of memorialization by Susan Einbinder that he references.
But they use the word ritualistic, right? So this was a mass suicide, and murder because they killed their children. But did they consider this when they were doing it an act of desperation or an actual religious ritual? Because when I hear ritual, I hear religious ritual. Is there another type I'm not aware of?
Well, okay, so why do I know all of this, right? One of the things that...
you read a lot.
What?
You read a lot.
But one of the things is I've only read Yuval actually more recently, but I've known this argument for decades. Because interestingly, I was in graduate school when Murray Rubin was a postgraduate fellow in Cambridge. At the same time, I was in graduate school with one of the serious significant scholars on this phenomenon of the Kaddish Hashem, the sanctification of the name, which in her research she found was associated with stories, reinterpretations of the story of Abraham and Isaac.
Yeah,
right.
That's what I was
The
thinking.
sacrifice of the children was like Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac. And in the Rhineland massacres that Cohen and Reuben and now Yuval are pointing to, they're saying they're sanctifying the name rather than allowing their children to be taken to be baptized. They're murdering them rather than having them be baptized.
Right.
By the Crusaders. I was aware of this because I was in graduate school in Cambridge from 1986 to 1988. And at that time, one of my contemporaries was Mary Minty. Yuval says, the completion of the book was accompanied by a sense of relief, since alongside the words of criticism, I found more and more people, particularly among younger historians, this is from 1999, who were willing to evaluate my approach sympathetically. In truth, what in 1993 was still considered by many a radical and controversial innovation was, by the time I finished the book in 1999, a view shared by at least 3 other scholars. Historians Ivan Marcus, Mary Minty, and Willis Johnson also felt, each in his or her own way and without knowing each other, that the story of the accusations of ritual murder had to be told in relation to the ideology of Kaddish Hashem. I was in college when Mary was carrying around back in the day we carried around stacks and stacks of photocopies, right? And she was showing me all the images of the sacrifice of Isaac, and she was talking to me. I mean, we were close friends for 2 years. I heard it all when she was working on it in 1986 to 88. At the same time when Yuval is working on it, and his book comes out, and by that time, it's already part of my work.
Right.
Okay. This is my book that was published. I'll go to my book, right? In 2001 or 2, I finished. Went up for tenure in 2001 on September 11th, so I remember that date. The copyright on my book is 2002. I'm pretty sure. Yes. And because Mary had taught me to pay attention to these stories and say, look, this is the most vivid thing that has happened. October 7th right now is huge. Everybody's seen all of the videos and on both sides, horrors, right? In 1096, after 1096, that kind of story was what everybody was telling about what happened along the Rhine.
Right. And because it was a reaction against baptism, it's almost like a ritual murder, right? The blood's flowing instead of water. And so it gets superimposed. The word, religious ritual gets superimposed on it because it was in a reaction against another religion's baptism. This is what I'm thinking.
You want to hear the story? Okay, so I have another one in my book, right? But this is one of the more famous ones. It's the Isaac ben David, the Parnas of Mainz. One thing we do know, and I go on to talk about in detail in my book, is the Christians were aware of these murders, and they were horrified. They were horrified that the Crusaders. So there's a one group of Crusaders led by Emiko Bleinigen. Pretty much every undergraduate knows about these right now. So it's unfortunate that Rabbi Barclay doesn't credit Candace Owens with maybe having a little bit more background, because she could. It's been out there for a long time. That this one group of Crusaders led by Emiko Bleinigen goes down the Rhine, and there are communities of Jews in the major towns along the Rhine. There's Mainz and Speyer and Worms, and the argument that Emiko makes, and he's not with the main group of the Crusaders at all. They've gone off to Constantinople and have their own issues with the emperor. Is we're going to go save the Holy Land, but why don't we deal with these Jews that are closer to hand? The confusing part about those communities along the Rhine is in fact how old they are. I'm not sure, and I've been looking around and trying to find out. Sometimes, like Yuval suggests they've been there for a long time, that they're historic communities. It's as likely because you're Ashkenazic, and the sort of wanderings of that group of people, which some research is now suggesting is traceable genetically, but who knows, out of Turkey possibly. It's clear that they have connections with Jews outside of Germany, and I think that's probably why they're settled there, in the same reason that the Jews are settled in Normandy in England by the Normans, that they're useful as agents, right? And if the Ashkenazi would be very useful as agents to the German kings, because they would have connections all along the Silk Road. They would go straight all the way across Asia, right? Which would be incredibly, incredibly useful. So therefore, they're protected by the bishops of the towns. Mainz is an archbishopric, and he's the prince of the town, right?
Right.
Okay. So this is Yuval. It's going to be a long passage because we want to get this in the record, right? The story in question is that of the suicide of Isaac ben David, the Parnas, Jewish community leader of Mainz, preceded by his killing his children and mother and setting fire to the synagogue. Most of the Jews of the community were killed while seeking refuge in the courtyard of the bishop. The bishop's courtyard was where they'd gone for protection as the Jews went in Norwich to the castle, right? So the bishop was trying to protect them. Only a few were saved, including Isaac, who agreed to convert. Okay, so he survives the initial mob violence. Note the explanation he is supposed to have given according to the Chronicle. I obeyed the foes only in order to rescue my sons from the hands of the evildoers, so they would not survive to live in error, for they are small and cannot distinguish between good and evil. End quote. Should a person convert to Christianity in order to save his children from Christianity? The approach described in the sources is the opposite. They are to be killed so that they will not convert. The narrator seems to be aware that forced converts were allowed to return to Judaism, which they were, thereby attempting to justify the father's conversion with his desire to save his children. Nevertheless, the narrator identifies completely with the views that Isaac's own deed could be atoned through death alone, and that is indeed what happened. 2 days after the riots in Mainz had subsided, Isaac returned to his father's house and discovered that the family treasure was untouched. The gap between the severe loss of life, which theoretically was the whole reason for the attacks, right, to take their money, but anyway, the gap between the severe loss of life that had befallen the community on the one hand and the sparing of his property on the other made him repent of his conversion, and he decided to carry out a ritual of atonement. First, he hired workers to repair his parents' damaged home. Next, he told his mother of his plan. I've decided to make a sin offering to God on high by which I shall find atonement. His mother, who had survived the pogroms without being baptized, lay wounded in the damaged house. But when she heard her son's intention, she pleaded with him for his own life and for hers, but in vain. Frantically, the man shut himself in the house and locked the door. He asked his children, for whose sake he had agreed to be baptized. So he'd baptized, his children are still alive.
Yeah.
Do you want me to slaughter you on the altar of our God? The children, who had earlier been described as not knowing the difference between good and evil, reply, do with us as you wish. A clear echo of Abraham's reply to Isaac, God will provide himself the lamb for burnt offering, my son. The man takes his children to the synagogue, and there, before the holy ark, he slaughters them. Quote, and he sprinkled their blood on the pillars of the holy ark and said, may this blood be atonement for all my sins. Oh. He then returns to his father's house and burns it down. It now becomes clear why he carefully repaired its doors beforehand to prevent those inside from escaping. Thus his mother was burned to death. The man then returned. It's over. The man then returns to the synagogue and burns it down as well. Quote, and the pious man went from corner to corner and from side to side, his hands stretched out in prayer to his Father in heaven, and he prayed to God from within the fire with a loud and pleasant voice. Christians who understood what was going on shouted at him, wicked man, come out of the light, and even tried to pull him out, but he refused to leave. Quote, and the innocent and honest and pious man was burned there. This is how our chronicler describes a man who killed his mother and his children with his own hands, burned down the synagogue of Mainz, not at the height of the pogroms, but 2 days later, when the Crusaders were no longer in the city.
Yeah, the pious man.
Right.
Yeah, that's why it becomes a ritual, not just because he was nuts and was trying to be Abraham. Worse than that, I don't think Abraham tried to burn his mother to death. If she had been alive.
Well, okay, but so this is
yeah.
this is what this is what I say they're interested in, and this is what Mary was working on too. How does their decision in 1096 to kill their families and themselves translate in the 12th century into the memorialization of the name? But the puzzling thing to the Christians at the time was, why did they kill themselves? Right?
So so this is just an account of one man, but there were more.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You want to hear another one? So this one's from my book.
I'm already horrified.
And that actually was my point in my book. The Christians who understood what had happened were horrified. I mean, you will always have, quoted in whatever polemical conversations, like, the ones that weren't horrified, but they're as I say, Christians not in company with Emico's crusaders were horrified. Bishops like Agilbert of Trier tried to convince the Jews under their protection to accept baptism and were bewildered when the Jews would not. I point out that it did work. The community in Regensburg, the people forced the entire community of Jews into the river and defiled them all simultaneously, as the Jewish chronicler Solomon Bar Simpson put it. And the enemy had not wished to slay them. The people of Regensburg saved their Jewish community by putting them in the river, saying, "You're baptized." And
so was this to keep the Crusaders, because were the Crusaders attempting to kill them if they didn't get baptized?
I mean, this is by Regensburg is further down the route. So by then the Christians in Regensburg go, "You're baptized." And then later the Jews are told, "No, forced baptism is not actual conversion." So
it doesn't count. Not even then. Yeah.
But I mentioned it's like, nevertheless, sometime later, theologians like Odo of Cambrai soon found out why the Jews had so resisted conversion. And I said there are these conversations that are going on about the Jews don't want to be baptized, right? And you can say it's water. What are you talking about? You'll die or be baptized.
Because they'll be excluded from their communities if they do this?
"We laugh at you and judge you insane," the Jew Leo purportedly told Odo in a conversation they had at Senlis. Quote, "For you say that God was enclosed in the obscene prison of the disgusting belly of his mother for 9 months, only to come out in 10th month from her shameful exit, pudindo, exitu, which cannot be looked upon without horror." But they're horrified by the incarnation. They're horrified by...
They're horrified by women's bodies.
Well, they're horrified by Mary. Even, indeed, as Guibord of Nogent even more viscerally put it, contemporary Jews insisted, quote, "No one who is not stupid believes that God would have projected himself into the vileness of a female womb, or would have developed in the usual manner. It is perfectly horrid that he whom you call God would be born through the virgin organs of a woman. Per mulieris virginalia funderator."
Oh, the misogyny is off the charts here.
Yeah. There were, of course, other objections against the Christian use of images, against the Trinity, but the incarnation was, in the early 12th century, this is me, undoubtedly the greatest stumbling block to Jewish conversion. As one of the leaders of the Mainz community defied his would-be baptizers, quote, "You are children of whoredom, believing as you do in a God who was a bastard and was crucified. As for me, I believe in the everlasting God who dwells in the lofty heavens." Okay. And again, according to Solomon Bar Simpson, as the Jews in the courtyard of Mainz slaughtered themselves, they cried out. So Solomon Bar Simpson is one of the most important chroniclers of these massacres. And so he's saying the Jews are killing themselves and they're crying out, quote, "Look and behold, O Lord, what we are doing to sanctify thy great name." That's the Kiddush Hashem. "In order not to exchange you for a crucified Sion who was despised, abominated, and held in contempt in his own generation, a bastard son conceived by a menstruating and wanton woman." That's Mary.
Hold on. I thought the Romans killed Jesus.
Not
the Jews.
Well, they do contemn the incarnation. And
yes.
I didn't understand the menstruating part until more recently, that she was Nida. She was actually in impurity, right? So they're making her as impure as they possibly can imagine, saying she's a whore and she's menstruating, and that's who Jesus was born to. we would never let ourselves be defiled by that.
Right, but he also makes the point of saying, and who was rejected by his own people, or something like that.
Crucified Sion.
Crucified, yeah.
Scion, not Zion.
Oh yeah, science. Yeah. Oh no, I understood that. Yeah.
Well, but it's what's clear is the Christians are going, wow, you really hate Jesus, don't you?
hate his mother and him.
And they weren't really terrifically well aware of this until this event, until 1096, and then they start asking questions. We have questions.
It's she's filthy and he's filthy by association. Right. That's their view of Christ.
But this is okay. So this is hard enough in Yuval's book, saying that the ritual murder accusation comes out of a context of Christians knowing that the Jews were, sacrificing their children. For example, there's another one from Mainz. So I did mention Isaac killing himself and his 2 children because he couldn't live with the defilement of being baptized. But others, like Rachel, daughter of Isaac ben Asher, wife of Judah of Mainz, refused even to consider saving her children's their lives. Others refused to consider saving even their lives or those of their children through baptism. This is how her story was told. I have 4 children, she told her companions. On them I will have no mercy, lest these uncircumcised ones come and seize them alive and they remain in their pseudo-faith. So they're saying they're worried that the children, if they're baptized, will stay Christian. With them as well, you must sanctify the name of holy God. End quote. Her companions killed her son Isaac, and she killed her daughters Bella and Matrona, who, having sharpened the knife, quote, stretched forth their necks willingly. But the 4th child, the boy Aaron, hid under a bureau until his mother dragged him out and sacrificed him as well. Quote, she placed them under her 2 sleeves, 2 on each side near her heart. They convulsed near her until the enemy seized the chamber and found her sitting and mourning them.
Like demonic possession.
Like the Christians that learned about this were astonished.
Well, yeah, as you can imagine, your neighbor's doing something like this, you would be astonished,
right?
Horrified and probably traumatized for life.
I think the mother killing her son Aaron by dragging him out from under the furniture where he's hiding so that he's not killed by his mom.
Yeah.
Sticks with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking of that scene in Downfall, right? When I forget which Nazi henchman it was, but he and his wife murdered all their children, and one of them was fighting it.
Yeah,
I couldn't watch that. I had to walk out of the room when the girl was fighting her own parents to try to live.
Right.
That's what it reminds me of. It's pretty horrifying.
So the Christians know about this. They know it shows up in the Chronicles of the Crusades. Albert of Aix described the events at Mainz. This is a Christian chronicler, and this is how he described it. Imico and the rest of his band held a council, and after sunrise attacked the Jews in the courtyard with arrows and lances. When the bolts and doors had been forced and the Jews had been overcome, they killed 700 of them, who in vain resisted the attack and assault on so many thousands. They slaughtered the women also, and with the point of their swords pierced young children of whatever age and sex. The Jews, seeing that their Christian enemies were attacking them and their children and were sparing no age, fell upon one another, brothers, children, wives, mothers, and sisters, and slaughtered one another. Horrible to say, mothers cut the throats of nursing children with knives and stabbed others, preferring to perish thus by their own hands rather than be killed by the weapons of the uncircumcised. It's horrible on all round, right?
It is, but how could they live amongst people they clearly detested?
Well, and that's the next level. Yuval shows that they did detest the Christians that they lived among and had for centuries, and they call them Rome.
Yeah.
even though they're not the pagan Romans, they're the Christians. And you need to read this. Everybody needs to read this book, because he goes through how the image of Esau as Edom is transferred over the centuries in the commentaries in the Jewish tradition to fit with first Rome, as in pagan Rome, and then Christian Rome. This solved for me a mystery that I had listening to the Adam King in the debate that he had with the others, where he's going, Rome has all of our treasures, and it's like, no, they don't. They were stolen by the barbarians ages ago when they sacked Rome in one of the many times in the early, But this transfer of story from one enemy to the next, I think what probably one of the things that's happened is and one of the things I don't know how to test in this is Yuval says this kind of belief in the need for vengeance and blood. It's a blood the Jewish chroniclers talk about how there is this story about they need vengeance to regain their land. So, and it's specifically the Ashkenazim, not the Sephardim. So the stories of
they need vengeance to gain their land. Sorry, I'm thinking of October 7th and what's happened since then.
The Ashkenazim developed and enhanced this Palestinian tradition after 1096. However, it's on page 102. However, the expectation of vengeance as a central component in the process of redemption had already been expressed even earlier. That seems to be what Theobald did in his telling Thomas of Monmouth that they needed vengeance. That part of and what Yuval says about that is the convert did what clever liars always do. He told a half-truth. The Jews indeed believed that the redemption depended on the annihilation of the Gentiles. During the first half of the 12th century, messianic notions such as these assumed a new meaning in the eyes of both Christians and Jews, when both camps ascribed enormous importance to the myths of sacrifice and blood, right? But what Yuval says is these longings for vengeance were prior to 1096. He found them in the liturgies before that, and they're not therefore trauma reactions to 1096. Rather, they are part of an entire messianic teaching, as shown by the presence of this motif in the Ashkenazic Piyut even before 1096. Rabbi Simeon ben Isaac, who lived at the beginning of the 10th century, in the Seliha entitled Arku HaYamim, asks God to avenge the blood of his servants, quote, and to fill a deep and broad cup with laughter and derision of their enemies. So it's a feature of the Ashkenazic liturgy before 1096, which probably explains some of what happened in 1096, that they were so horrified at the idea of being defiled by baptism that they would kill their children. And then the Christians learn about this and they're like, what did they just do? All right. So it becomes general knowledge. And what I argue in my book is it's general knowledge very, very quickly within, immediate, right? My next example is Honorius Augustinensis, who's writing this book, the Sigillum Beata Maria, the Seal of Blessed Mary, around 1100, so like 4 years or so after it. And Honorius was a student of Anselm of Canterbury, and we've mentioned Anselm of Canterbury already as being interested in arguing for the incarnation, right? One of the interesting things that Honorius argues is about the Jews and their relationship to Mary. There was nothing obvious or banal for Honorius and his contemporaries about Mary's role in the incarnation. Rather, it was a living and quite sore point of theological and devotional debate, as we've seen. If contemporary Jews insisted that the doctrine of the incarnation was nothing short of an insult to God, and that the height of the insult was the suggestion that God had not only confined himself within a woman's womb, but also, horrible for them to think, come forth into the world through her shameful exit, then to defend Mary's purity as both virgin and mother was hardly, as has been so often suggested, an effort to denigrate other women, particularly other mothers. That's a common feminist argument, like, oh, Mary's so pure, that's, insulting other women. It's like, no. Her purity is material in this situation. It was to champion the idea that God might deign to become human, and to do so literally through a woman, more precisely through her vagina. let's get typical. They do. I mean, it's like Christ is born through her, right? The more disgusting Jews found this idea, the more Christians found themselves forced to defend it. They don't actually talk about it in quite this level of detail until the 12th century. and I think it does come out of, it comes out of this contest, right, of discussion. The more disgusting Jews found this idea, the more Christians found themselves forced to defend it or convert. For there was no middle ground in the 12th century, no place where one might stand and argue that the incarnation was, as the 19th century said, a convenient myth, right? It's like it happened or it didn't. Do you recognize it or not? No, if God became a man, then he did so in a woman's belly, and if he came out of that confining belly through the same exit as her menstrual blood. If medieval Christians like Honorius insisted on that mother's purity, they did not, as would many of their 21st century descendants, become immediately squeamish on thinking about what happened to the afterbirth or where the milk in her breasts came from. But there's more, right? In the Seal of Blessed Mary, what Honorius does is he takes the Song of Songs and makes it into a drama of Mary's death and assumption into heaven. And it's very interesting because it's liturgical, and he's taking the fact that they use the Song of Songs to describe Mary's exaltation into heaven, and he literally turns it into a drama. I talk about it as this dialogue. He likes dialogues a lot. And so most of it's, Mary's being recognized by Christ and their love for each other and stuff like that. But there's at the very end of the story, there's this very arresting little vignette. Who shall give you to me for my brother? Mary asks her son in the last scene of the Sigillum. Quote, and who shall give you to me for my brother is from the Song of Songs. That's born of the people of Judea. It's hard to italicize my own voice, right? Because what he's doing is he's interweaving the text of the song with what Mary is saying. So, song, who shall give you to me for my brother? Born of the people of Judea, not song, but his insertion. So saying Mary is born of the people of Judea, right?
Right.
Quote, sucking the breasts of my mother, end quote. That is, taught in the synagogue under the law, quote, that I might find you without, end quote. That is, I might see you being worshipped by the Jews who are thus far outside the faith, quote, and kiss you, end quote. That is, that I might perceive you being loved by them. She's praying for the Jews to love him. Right. Quote, and now no man may despise me, as the Jews have, right? Namely, there will be no one of the Jews who will not believe that I remained a virgin. Quote, I will take hold of you, end quote. That is, I will prove that you took flesh of me without the seed of man, quote, and bring you through faith, quote, into my mother's house, end quote. That is, into the body of the synagogue itself. This is pretty powerful, right? Because remember, they've been slaughtering their own children rather than convert.
Yeah.
And here Honorius is saying Mary is praying for them to be brought into the synagogue, to be brought into love of her son. Quote, there you shall teach me that you will be worshipped by them, and they will keep the precepts of the Lord. There's another verse in the Song of Songs that he also references at this point. I'm seeing what's the best. I obviously wrote this not quite to make the point we're making here. Oh yes, here is what Mary promises. That the line in the Song of Songs is, if she be a wall, let us build upon it by bulwarks of silver. If she be a door, let us join it together with boards of cedar. And in Honorius's imagining, he has Mary say this. Remember, she's talking about bringing synagogue into the church, into Christ. I will be a wall for them, because if they imitate my life, they will be unconquerable by vice, and my breasts are as a tower. That is, through my examples, they will be safe in goodness. Since I am become in his presence as one finding peace, that is, from the time when I appeased him with prayers on their behalf, the synagogue, and obtained for them his peace and grace, this prayer was answered because the peaceable one, namely Christ, had a vineyard, because the true vine, as in the offspring of the blessed, willed to be begotten in me, in that which had people, that is, in my people, which brought forth the humble ones, namely the apostles. And when I say, how much more arresting must it have been to read these words in the early 12th century when so many had so recently died, refusing to do just that, worship Christ, to believe that he took flesh from a woman and came forth like a precious pearl from between her thighs. And how much more chilling must it have been for them to reflect on Mary's reassurance to her sister Synagoga. And the image I'm showing now is from another of Honorius' commentary on the song, but it's the bride and the bridegroom, and he's got his hand out the window bleeding onto the Sunamite who's under the tree, right? So
Right.
Honorius is big about bringing the synagogue into salvation and healing. I will be a wall for them. When those who had survived at Speyer in 1096, for example, did so only because they found protection within the recently walled quarter of their own town.
Yeah.
This was an image to rivet the attention of even the most frivolous novice as his mind wandered in prayer. This was an image that would call instantly to mind both the terrors of the judgment and the great contingency of mercy on the success of the prayers of the Virgin to her son. That's what real medieval Christians say, not fantasy ones that you make up
praying for their conversion.
Yes.
Yeah, they love them because Christ loved them, Christ loved them, and therefore they love who Christ.
And they have Mary. It's like a lot of, I had to deal with that because a lot of there's famously Chaucer's story about the prioress has a miracle of Mary, and that unfortunately devotion to Mary has gotten wrapped up in the modern scholarship with claims of anti-Semitism because she prays for their conversion.
Yeah, I will never understand that. Oh my goodness, I wish I remembered his name. There was an elderly rabbi it was like a man on the street interview. And they were talking to him about the prayer for the conversion of the Jews that was removed from the Good Friday prayers in the Catholic Church. And it was because the prayer contained the word perfidious. It's like, well, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Well,
perfidious
means they don't have faith.
Right, I know, but I mean, that's arguable that they did. They just had a different one. I can see getting rid of that word, but they threw out the entire thing, and they're asked this man about it, and I think he might have been a rabbi. He said, "I don't understand why they did that." He said, "Well, if you basically said, if you care for somebody, you want them to convert. You pray for their conversion."
That's yes, right.
So it was beautiful. He said, "We pray for other people who aren't Jews all the time."
And the Christians have been praying for the conversion of the Jews since Jesus told us to.
Right. Because they consider it to be, I'm just guessing now, the people who would find offensive this, they can't conceive of any good that involves not being Jewish. It's like that in itself makes you a good person. Therefore, if you pray for my conversion, you're praying for me to be a bad person. But if you don't share that Christian's faith, what are his prayers to you? Does it even matter?
Well, that's why Yuval is so challenging, because he's showing that a good deal of Judaism was built up around the desire for vengeance. Yes, well, I was just thinking that when you're describing the people massacring their own children, that's what they did at Masada. So maybe that's why their obsession with Rome, everything's Rome. Rome is bad. Yes, it goes back to the destruction of the temple in Masada, for sure. Right, yes. Right, where they killed all their own children. And it might have been Josephus who was smuggled out, but they wouldn't let anyone leave. Same description. They locked the doors so nobody could leave, right? So they had guards on the exit so nobody could leave. So he was smuggled out, and he said that he did this because he wanted to write about it. He didn't want these people to be forgotten. So he had people smuggle him out, and then that's when he wrote about it. So yeah, that's. So why would American Jews, and we're back to Peter now. Why would American Jews want to be insisting on the uniqueness of the atrocities? One of the things that Rabbi Barclay kept saying was anti-Semitism is to wish for the eradication of the Jewish people. I'm not sure that's true. Well, so the thing is, I do think you can play it on Google Ngram. The word anti-Semitism spikes up after about 1880, right? It's a neologism that is used for particular projects. Well, that's because it's related to Zionism, right?
This has to be a boogeyman to rally people to support, the state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel,
right?
And to get people to move there in the 1880s.
Well, the state doesn't exist at that point, but yes, they have a project
it doesn't,
for.
But they had plans for it to exist, which is why they convinced a whole bunch of European Jews to move there and take up farming, who had never done it before.
Right.
But this is at the beginning of our discussion. I said, now, is Barclay doing this because they want more Jews to move to Israel? This is related to what I think Netanyahu's plan seems to be, to completely empty Gaza. And then they will have a bunch more land there to move people into. This is speculation on my part. But if you ask me why is he doing that? It's like, well, they did it in the 1880s to get people to move to what was then called Palestine.
Right.
Right? Is he doing the same thing now?
We could do another. I have all the colleagues I need for all of these conversations, because another of my former colleagues is Rashid Khalidi, who has written on Palestine because his family was from Palestine. He's at Columbia, professor at Columbia. So we could. I'd have to do some more reading for that one. This one I can read from my own book,
more
right?
Qualified than me, for sure.
And say, this 1144 stuff. You're not stop hand waving and making the Middle Ages your boogeyman. It doesn't explain what's happening now, and specifically, it doesn't explain that the language of the unique that is a feature of particularly American conversation about this problem. And this is our closing thought, right? That Peter Novick pointed to. He said, one of the, and this deep story, you need to read the whole thing, that the Holocaust is not a feature of American Jewish conversation pretty much at all in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
It becomes a thing from the 70s, and that's why he was interested in it as a historian. It's like, why did this? American Jews were not murdered in the Holocaust. Many people escaped the Holocaust and came to America. Right. And so he was like saying, wait a minute. Why is this fear in the United States? We were the place that people had refuge in, right? So why does the Holocaust, and that's why it's the Holocaust in American life. It's like, how does it become an essential feature of American imagination of what it means to be Jewish?
Well, I'd like to see what our foreign spending on the state of Israel was at the time in the 1970s, whether it spiked and started going up. Foreign aid.
Interestingly, he didn't find a direct association with our aid. What was interesting, and that, I mean, that could be a way to consider it or think about it. What he did, he said it was identity politics.
But for what purpose?
Well,
people use identity politics all the time.
But he's writing in the 90s, right? And so that's specifically when our culture of victimization is really getting off the ground, right? And saying that there was this climate of victimhood in the background, and shared victimhood, and this problem of, in the United States, talking about all the movement of peoples, right?
Yeah.
From the 1960s on, the United States began to be seen as, not the we of the United States, but the we of the subgroups in we blacks, we women, we gays, we Jews.
Me too.
Yeah. Right. But he says it's in this context that the American Jews start using the Holocaust as their defining identity.
Not until the 1990s?
80s, 90s. Yeah.
I think it was the 70s when Israel had some success in rounding up some war criminals and bringing them to trial.
Well, it starts in the, right? It's in the 1970s when the Holocaust moved to the center of American culture. And it's
right. That was with the miniseries.
Right, with the miniseries. Right. So he's looking at a 25-year development from the 1970s into the 1990s by this point.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying, so, and his argument being, it's specifically in this context of the victim politics that Jewish identity gets latched onto that. It was against this background and in this cultural climate that virtually celebrated victimhood that efforts to firm up faltering Jewish identity were mounted. It is not that Jewish leaders deliberately and opportunistically latched onto a fashionable victimhood as the basis for an identity that could mobilize Jews and ensure Jewish continuity. In any case, parentheses, as I've said, there is no united Jewish leadership capable of making such choices. Rather, the heightened,
I do like to argue.
the heightened status of the victim removed inhibitions that had been previous decades led them to shun that label. The culture of victimization didn't cause Jews to embrace a victim identity based on the Holocaust. It allowed this sort of identity to become dominant because it was, after all, virtually the only one that could encompass those Jews whose faltering Jewish identity produced so much anxiety about Jewish survival.
Okay, that's it right there. It's population.
They're assimilating to American culture.
Right. Not just that, but they're intermarrying, which means they're creating non-Jews.
Exactly. Right? It was very hard to find any other basis on which to ground a distinctive identity shared by all Jews. It couldn't be grounded in distinctive religious beliefs, since most Jews didn't have much in the way of such beliefs. I'm reading right now. It couldn't be grounded in distinctive cultural traits, since most didn't have much of these either. It was fun having Peter in my department. I had, people that had real debates. You can imagine.
Yeah, real debate is good. People.
And Rashid was in the department at this time, right? We had Rashid and Peter, Palestinian and Jewish, right? Support of Israel exerted a certain centripetal force, but in recent years, this is 1999, questions having to do with Israel have divided more than they have united Jews. And we're seeing that now, too, right? The questions of Israel are dividing. The only thing that all American Jews shared was the knowledge that but for the immigration of near or distant ancestors, they would have shared the fate of European Jewry. Insofar as the Holocaust became the defining Jewish experience, all Jews had their honorary survivorship in common. Insofar as it attained mythic status, expressing truths about enduring Jewish condition, all were united in essential victim identity.
And that's where they're pushing up against the culture of the 90s, the Me Too. Right. Is that before it became Me Too? Because people says, I'm Armenian. What do you do with that question? Right. Or my ancestors are they're Irish. They came here in the 1850s. What are you gonna do with that?
And this is where it got ramped up, and this is what Peter's showing. The most common Jewish response to the charge that Jews were intent on permanent possession of the gold medal in the victimization Olympics, his term, has been to protest that it was others, not they, who were engaged in competition. Jews were the aggrieved party. They are stealing the Holocaust from us, said Elie Wiesel. Others were illegitimately appropriating language and imagery to which they were not entitled. As we saw in the previous chapter, this was often described as the theft of Jewish moral capital. The use of the word ghetto for black slums was frequently cited as an example of stealing the Holocaust. There is no barbed wire across 125th Street, and there are no guard towers. There is no, that's quote, no place in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago was even remotely like Buchenwald in 1938 or Warsaw in 1942 or Auschwitz in 1944, end quote. The most commonly expressed Jewish grievance was the use of the word Holocaust and genocide to describe other catastrophes.
How dare you?
This sense of grievance was rooted in the conviction, axiomatic and at least official Jewish discourse, that the Holocaust was unique. Since Jews recognized the Holocaust's uniqueness, that it was incomparable beyond any analogy, they had no occasion to compete with others. There could be no contest over the incontestable. It was only those who, out of ignorance or malice, denied the uniqueness of the Holocaust who could be so foolish as to engage in competition. Parentheses. Some scholars, in fact, characterize denial of the Holocaust uniqueness as a form of Holocaust denial.
Oh, there's that phrase.
The word unique is often used loosely and casually as an attention-getting intensifier. Try our unique dishwashing liquid. I met this guy last night and he's like unique. Claims that one's own suffering is unique and communicable to others are also common. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow. But in the case of the alleged uniqueness of the Holocaust, we're in the presence not of loose usage and hyperbole, but of serious philosophical and historical arguments. Indeed, a substantial scholarly literature which aim at logical and empirical demonstration that the Holocaust is unique, is unlike any other atrocity, a demonstration that will compel non-Jews to acknowledge this fact.
Compel. That's an interesting word. that was what Barclay was trying.
Yes.
I've yet to hear an argument that proves its uniqueness.
Well, he can't. I mean, Peter, the previous book that he did on.
No, not him. I'm thinking Barclay.
Right. No, but the thing is, it can't. I mean, it's philosophically incoherent claim, which Peter's previous work was on historiography and the problem of objectivity. He gets it as this problem of once you start, it's like if you're, and he says this, I remarked in the introduction that the very idea of uniqueness is fatuous. Since any event, a war, a revolution, a genocide, will have significant features that it shares with events to which it might be compared, as well as features that differentiate it from others. The claim that an event, as opposed to some features in an event, is unique can be sustained only by gerrymandering, deliberately singling out one or more distinctive features of the event and trivializing or sweeping under the rug those features that it shares with other events to which it might be compared. For Katz, what makes the Holocaust unique, makes it the only real genocide, is that, quote, never before has a state set out to annihilate physically every man, woman, and child belonging to a specific people. End quote. If Katz is historic, some have said that about Gaza recently. If Katz is historically correct on this point, and historians who examined his arguments have their doubts, this would indeed be a distinctive feature of the Holocaust. How did Katz decide that this is the criterion by which one should decide whether the Holocaust is unique, the only genocide? He himself supplies the answer when he writes that while the final solution of many other features, quote, only the element of intentionality can serve as the individuating criterion by which to distinguish the Shoah from other instances of mass death, end quote. Translation, this is Peter's revision. I was determined to find that feature of the Holocaust which set it apart, made it unique, and this is the one I settled on. Yeah, Peter did. I mean, you can find some of his videos on. He did talks after this book came out, and he got a lot of pushback.
It sounds great. Yeah, I mean, it sounds really thoughtful what he wrote.
But he's trying to. There's a stinger at the end, though, right? It's like you want Hitler to win. You want Hitler to have won. Whether the memories of slavery, the Holocaust, or any of the other terrible events of human history whose scars do the work of the wound. The role of that memory in group consciousness has to be carefully considered. And this is the reason I'm obviously interested in this for a lot of reasons, but 1096 created one of those kinds of scars, and it became defining for Jewish identity through the sanctification of the name, which is what Mary was studying when I was a graduate student. So I was aware of that, and that's why where I understood that Honorius was responding to those events when he said Mary prays for the synagogue. Mm-hmm. That trauma event, it's like, what do you do with it? In the 12th century, they turn it into a memorialization. You need to remember the names, which I think is obviously also a feature of Holocaust memorialization, right? You must remember the names.
Yeah.
So the role of memory is very important. There's a sense in which Emil Fackenheim was right to say that for Jews to forget Hitler's victims would be to grant him a posthumous victory. Okay, so we will not forget them. We will remember them. We will name them. Name all of them. And in Jewish tradition, that's incredibly important because the name is the sanctification of the name is of God, but that sense of you remembering the name matters deeply. Okay, so if we forget them, Hitler wins. But it would be an even greater posthumous victory for Hitler were we to tacitly endorse his definition of ourselves as despised pariahs by making the Holocaust the emblematic Jewish experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that explains the hysteria that was on display in the interview. It doesn't explain to me why they want that to be the defining feature of Judaism across different Jewish ethnicities around the world.
I mean, so the book I'm showing now, Blood Libel, Hannah Johnson. If you dispute with me, please read her book. She goes through. She's a Christian writing about the Jewish scholars that have been writing. Yuval and Novik and Nirenberg and Rubin and Cohen are all Jewish, right? So these are Jewish scholars writing about their own histories within their communities, and hopefully in conversation with Christians as we are. And Johnson has done a very important study. Her book is the one where I was first really reading in depth about Yuval. She's also writing about some other books, Gavin Langmuir's Histories of Anti-Semitism, and a book that I've seen out there discussed on the internet, Ariel Toaf's Bloody Passover. Very interestingly, she points out that many of these debates come from within Jewish discussion, right? That they're not really, I mean, the ones in the 12th century are Christian Jewish conversations. Toaf's book, it's Pascha de Sangue, Bloody Passovers, which he released and then retracted because it created so much furore among Jews. Because he finds, he deals with the Simon of Trent accusation, which was in northern Italy, but against some Ashkenazic immigrants into the region. And he makes the argument in Bloody Passovers that there was possible evidence to be considered, right? And everybody goes, oh my gosh, he found the truth. It's, hold your horses. Hold your horses.
Or just brought up the fact that you should actually look at evidence.
Well, it's
nobody wants to do.
Right, but it turns out that he is within his own political conversation in Israel, right? That we have the because he talks about things like fundamentalism and ultra-orthodoxy. And there is a in a 2007 interview after the initial release of his book, Toaf clearly identified the relevant actors in his historical drama, Bloody Rituals. Those who engaged in such practices, he said, were, quote, an extremist sect, German, acting beyond the Alps and below in Trent. So Ashkenazi, right? So you could call them Canaan, the jealous ones, observant and ultra-Orthodox. People who feared lest it be known what they were doing because they were certain that the heads of the Ashkenazi communities would have reported them. This concerns a few extremists who initiate such a revenge between 1100 and 1500. Notice.
Oh, yeah, that's political.
but apparently the Theobald that Thomas of Monmouth quotes is of a similar, it's like there's internal, some of it is like, okay, so if you're trying to understand Christian history and you're talking about Cathars, or you're talking about, Arians, or you're talking, how much of this, it's like, and those of us outside.
Oh, no, so it's like you're explaining why the convert monk who was interviewed about William's murder would have said something like that.
This is where we are. And so the reason Johnson wrote this book is she's saying blood libel is one of the hardest things for us to talk about as a historiographical problem because it's instantly tangled up with present discussions. Yeah. And that's what her book is in fact the she calls it the ritual murder accusation and the limit of Jewish history. All of these are debates within debates. Right. So Yuval makes it the Ashkenazi have this vengeance tradition, but the Sephardim, they don't really. Right. So, OK, that's Jewish and that's German and Spanish. Toaf is apparently secular Israeli. Yeah. And he's making arguments like you're doing the same thing that the Christians think Jews have horns argument is you're projecting your own present divisions of rhetoric back onto, oh, look, we found it in the past, therefore it must be, perdurable and instant. And and Toaf has arguments about the ultra-Orthodox in Israel now.
Right. That's why I said ouch. Yeah, because I'm aware of the political fights going on over there. And sometimes they turn physical, but with groups.
Right. So they're internal to those communities, and they leak out into, it's like with Theobald and his half-truth and stories, it's like who believes what and on what basis is because there's these imperfect sources of information on multiple sides.
Right. Yeah, because everybody has their own particular reason for engaging in the argument to begin with. And there's multiple.
At which point she freezes. So no.
I know I'm frozen.
Okay.
I've been frozen for 4 minutes. I was hoping I wasn't frozen on your
No,
end.
you've frozen. I think
I know. It looks like I'm sleeping.
you're thoughtful. You're contemplative by now.
That's it.
Right. And we have been going on
I'm
for a very long time.
deeply.
We've had a tiny live audience. Apparently this was not something anybody wanted to cope with live. So we will end with this reflection that I have. We're back with Candace and Rabbi Barclay. AD 1144 is separated from AD 1944 by 800 years. The ways that we make historical arguments actually matter a lot. Now, it's odd, I think, to blame the Middle Ages for something that happened in modernity, frankly.
It's not odd at all.
Well, because modernity has persistently defined itself against the Middle Ages since the French Revolution by the rejection of the Middle Ages and, more importantly, of the Catholic Church, right?
Well, yeah, but as you pointed out before, it's so far away. It's so long ago. Who's going to know or look? I'm just gonna put it out there as if I know what I'm talking about, and then you'll believe anything because it was 800 years ago.
Yes, right. And so that's been happening too. That what we're dealing with when it's like, medieval Christians believed all these sorts of things. I'm like, look, the medieval Christians I've written about actually pray for the Jews, and they often convert. Help them convert, and they actually. Yes, they have debates with them and they understand the actual theological differences that they have, and they take them seriously and try to consider how you might answer that. And sometimes we know, as for example, with Rupert, whom I also talk about in my book, they convince people to convert. So that's a feature of the story too. Not just the misunderstandings and so forth. I want to know, Internet, who is telling the stories about, I wrote it down in my notes as the need to hate Jews and why, but it's like Rabbi Barclay started off with saying, you realize that this is just feeding the hate.
Right, the boogeyman, you're making them bigger.
Notice who keeps reiterating this claim and compare it with what actual medieval Christians like Honorius Augustinianus said. Christians love and pray for the Jews that they may be converted to Christ and saved and gathered into the walls of the heavenly city to sing praises to our Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen.
We hope those of you who listen to this video will take that into consideration the next time you see these sorts of boogeyman arguments used to make you anxious and hateful of people whom Christians have been praying for centuries.
All right. Yeah, you neither hate the person praying or the person they're praying for.
Kilt's making screenshots. Thank you. So
not of a sleeping me.
Well, actually, she has one of sleeping you with the blood libel book. You closed your eyes to that one. You don't to take it there. I would say, are there any questions? But we have not, in fact, had a giant live audience. I thought this, and Hans says, my hotel internet isn't up to watching the stream live. I'll have to download the audio and listen later. Well, we hope everyone enjoys this long version of what happened in that minute and 34 seconds and realize there's probably more going on in all of the hints and associations and allusions and terrors that the enemy, who in fact is the enemy, wants you to believe, which is being afraid of your fellow human beings, when we should be praying for each other, not to be taken in by those kinds of atrocity stories. Yes. Okay. Well, I'm good. I'm sorry for Casey that she looks so sleepy and quiet, because she's.
Well, it's only been since 10:34, so it's not that bad. Actually,
it's 10 minutes.
Well this time.
It's 10 minutes. 10 minutes of we almost made it through Skype, and with
That's
your
right.
Skype.
We almost
at least your Skype didn't drop you this time. Okay. Well, we thank you all for listening. We hope some of you listened through all the way to the end. I mean, we took longer than Candace did with Rabbi Barclay, so hopefully it was worth some of the references that we were able to give. Go read more. Don't let people use history to make you panic, and ask for the dates and make sure that you go and read the sources and recognize that even in the Middle Ages, people were capable of sifting evidence and trying to figure out what was true and what wasn't, and were willing to talk to people whom they considered their enemy. Pray for each other.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you and good night. Subscribe, listen, come back. We love you all. Bye.